In April 1945, the thunder of 1,000,000 Soviet guns roared across the Oder River, tearing through the mist of dawn as the Red Army hurled itself against the last great German defences before Berlin. At the Seelow Heights, miles of trenches, bunkers and minefields stood between Stalin's forces and the Nazi capital, while desperate German troops, outnumbered and exhausted, clung to every ridge and ravine. The ground shook with relentless artillery fire, tanks clawed forward through mud and smoke, and the skies above screamed with aircraft as the fate of the Third Reich drew to its bloody conclusion. This was not just another battle, it was the gateway to Berlin, where courage and carnage collided on a scale few could imagine. Tonight we bring you the entire story of the Battle of the Seelow Heights, the strategies, the chaos, the human cost, and the final push that opened the gates of Berlin. So close your eyes, let the sounds of history carry you into sleep. And before we begin, share in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is there, because together across time zones and continents, we relive the final march to Berlin. By the winter of 1945, the once vast and terrifying Eastern Front was collapsing under the weight of Soviet power. For nearly 4 years, the Wehrmacht had bled itself dry across the endless steppes, forests and cities of the Soviet Union. The tide that had turned at Stalingrad and Kursk now rolled westward like an unstoppable flood. German armies that once numbered in the millions were reduced to scattered remnants, clinging to defensive lines carved out of desperation. Towns and villages lay in ruins, burned during retreat or crushed under advancing tanks. Civilians wandered the frozen roads in endless columns, fleeing both German and Soviet wrath. The Red Army, hardened by brutal years of attritional combat, advanced with confidence and fury, its soldiers knowing Berlin itself lay only weeks away. To the east, Poland had been consumed, its capital Warsaw left a gutted ruin in the wake of resistance and retribution. To the north, East Prussia trembled under waves of Soviet artillery and vengeance, and to the west, the Oder River now marked the final natural barrier between Hitler's Reich and the heart of Germany itself. Adolf Hitler, entrenched deep within the Führerbunker in Berlin, refused to acknowledge the inevitability of defeat. Obsessed with maps, shifting imaginary divisions, and commanding armies that no longer existed, he remained convinced that one last counterstrike could shatter the Soviet momentum. Generals whispered about the futility of the situation, yet none dared speak openly of surrender. Loyalty, fear, and fanaticism bound them to a leader who no longer understood reality. To Hitler, retreat was unthinkable, an admission that the 1,000-year Reich had crumbled in barely 12. He demanded his armies stand and die where they were, turning every village, every river, and every hill into a fortress. To his people, he promised secret weapons and salvation, but to his officers he issued only death sentences disguised as orders. Supplies were gone, manpower depleted, and fuel nearly vanished, yet the demands grew more impossible each day. As the Soviets massed along the Oder, Hitler insisted that the German people must prove their worthiness through suffering. To him, the destruction of Germany itself was preferable to compromise. On the Soviet side, the Red Army was preparing its greatest push yet, a massive operation designed to smash open the gates of Berlin. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the iron-willed commander of the First Belarusian Front, assembled one of the largest concentrations of men and machines in history. Over 2.5 million soldiers stood ready, supported by more than 6,000 tanks, 40,000 artillery pieces, and thousands of aircraft. Alongside him, Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front prepared to strike further south, driving toward Dresden and eventually joining the assault on the German capital. Supplies poured into the front lines, endless columns of trucks, ammunition crates, fuel barrels, and food rations to sustain the storm about to break. Soldiers, many veterans from Stalingrad and Kursk, readied themselves for the final march into Germany's heart. Their resolve was fueled by revenge for the millions lost, for the burning of their cities, and for the horrors uncovered in Nazi camps. The Red Army was no longer the desperate force of 1941, it was an unstoppable machine. Yet even now, the Soviets knew the final battles would be costly, as the Germans would fight with the ferocity of a cornered animal. The Oder would run red before Berlin fell. The German civilian population felt the storm long before the front reached their homes. Refugee trains, overcrowded and chaotic, choked the railways of the Reich. Families fled from East Prussia and Silesia, carrying what little they could in carts or on foot, often overtaken by Soviet tanks. Bombers from the West, British and American, turned German cities into seas of rubble. Dresden burned, Hamburg smoldered, and Cologne was reduced to ash, while Berlin itself endured nightly raids. Children dug trenches, elderly men were handed rifles, and women worked in the ruins to build defenses. The Volkssturm, Hitler's last gamble, recruited boys as young as 12, and men in their 60s, arming them with old rifles, captured weapons, or even Panzerfausts made for one suicidal use. Leaflets rained from the sky, promising the Allies vengeance if resistance continued, but propaganda still shouted of final victory. Fear consumed the Reich, yet hope of salvation lingered among the most loyal. For ordinary Germans, survival was all that remained. Hitler's generals found themselves trapped between reality and obedience. Men like Guderian, once brilliant commanders, pleaded for strategic withdrawals to preserve what little strength remained. Yet every suggestion met Hitler's furious refusal, often ending in tirades that left even hardened officers silent. The Seelow Heights, a line of ridges east of Berlin, were hastily fortified into the Reich's last strong shield. Field Marshal Gotthard Heinrici, tasked with holding the Oder front, prepared his men as best as he could. He ordered civilians evacuated, artillery concealed, and defensive belts dug deep into the earth. Trenches were filled with mud-barbed wire stretched across fields, and hidden anti-tank guns waited in ambush positions. Heinrici was one of the few commanders still respected for his realism, yet even he knew the defense would only delay the inevitable. Still, delay was everything Hitler demanded. Every hour the Soviets were held back was another hour for the Reich to exist. The German army, now more shadow than force, braced itself for the storm. The soldiers of both sides understood the coming battle would be apocalyptic, for the Germans defending their homeland ignited both desperation and fanaticism. They dug into bunkers and pillboxes, staring eastward across the flat plains toward the rising thunder of Soviet artillery. For the Soviets, the final prize, Berlin, was visible on the horizon, only 60 miles away from the Oder. Soldiers painted slogans on their tanks. To Berlin and for Mother Russia. The ground itself seemed to groan under the weight of preparations, as thousands of guns were wheeled into position. Every soldier, whether German or Soviet, carried with him the scars of 4 years of merciless war. Death was no longer an abstraction, it was a familiar companion. And yet, despite the exhaustion, both armies prepared to fight with everything they had left. In the east, fire and steel gathered like a storm about to break. Meanwhile, in Berlin, life took on an eerie rhythm of denial and dread. Propaganda broadcasts still spoke of wonder weapons that would destroy the Allies, of divisions massing for counterstrikes, of miracles that never came. Yet in the streets, ration lines stretched for blocks, and the sound of artillery could sometimes be faintly heard from the east. Families slept in cellars as Allied bombers lit the skies, and children played among ruins, too young to understand the collapse of the world around them. The Gestapo continued to hunt dissenters, executing those who spoke of surrender. The city's leadership urged citizens to prepare for the battle for Berlin, turning even apartment buildings into strongpoints. Posters declared, "The Führer commands, we obey," but faith was fraying. Rumors spread of Hitler's worsening health, of his generals' despair, and of the Soviets already crossing into German soil. The Reich's capital, once the symbol of Nazi power, now stood like a fortress crumbling from within. Time was running out, and everyone knew it. Thus, as spring arrived in 1945, the stage was set for one of the final and bloodiest clashes of the Second World War. On the plains east of Berlin, millions of men and machines gathered, poised to decide the fate of Europe. Hitler, blinded by his delusions, demanded resistance to the last man, while his people prepared for annihilation. The Soviets, determined to claim vengeance and victory, prepared to hurl everything at the Seelow Heights. The Oder would be crossed in fire, and the hills beyond would become the anvil upon which the Reich was shattered. In the villages and forests around the front, soldiers sharpened bayonets, loaded shells, and wrote farewell letters. The war had reached its crescendo, a final struggle that would determine not just Germany's fate, but the entire post-war world. Soon Berlin itself would tremble under the footsteps of the Red Army, and as both sides readied for the storm, history marched toward its inevitable climax. The battle for the gates of Berlin was about to begin. As winter melted into spring in 1945, the Soviet Union prepared to deliver the final hammer blow of the war in Europe. The man tasked with orchestrating this decisive strike was Marshal Georgy Zhukov, a veteran commander whose reputation had been forged in battles from Moscow to Kursk. His name carried both fear and respect, not only among his own soldiers, but also among the Germans who knew of his relentlessness. In early April, Stalin gave Zhukov and his fellow marshal Ivan Konev the ultimate directive: capture Berlin at any cost. The prestige of being the conqueror of the German capital meant glory, but also unbearable pressure. Zhukov understood that the final assault would be unlike any before, an operation of unimaginable scale and complexity. To succeed, the Red Army would have to cross formidable defenses, face a fanatical enemy, and sustain momentum through dense terrain. Every division, every gun, and every tank had to be positioned with absolute precision. Behind the operational orders lay months of planning, endless logistical coordination, and the grim acceptance that casualties would be staggering. The Red Army was now assembling for the most massive offensive of the European war. Just a phase. Zhukov's plan envisioned a colossal frontal assault across the Oder River line, directly into the Seelow Heights, which formed the last natural barrier before Berlin. It was a strategy of overwhelming force, designed to crush the enemy with sheer weight of men and firepower. He commanded the First Belarusian Front, comprising nearly 1 million soldiers, supported by over 20,000 artillery pieces and rocket launchers. Alongside them stood thousands of tanks, self-propelled guns, and aircraft, a war machine unmatched in scale. The central idea was simple: a massive artillery barrage would shatter German defenses, opening the way for infantry and armor to pour through. But Zhukov knew that simple on paper meant nothing in the chaos of war. The Germans were dug in on the high ground, determined to fight for every inch of soil. Still, Zhukov had no room for hesitation, for Stalin himself demanded results in days, not weeks. Berlin was only 60 kilometers away, close enough to ignite the imagination of every Soviet soldier. The offensive would be nothing less than the final storm of the Eastern Front. Bernicki. The build-up for the Berlin offensive was an extraordinary feat of logistics, stretching the limits of Soviet supply systems. Railways creaked under the burden of moving men, tanks, shells, and fuel to the Oder. Thousands of trucks, wagons, and horses ferried supplies forward in endless convoys, churning up the muddy spring roads. Engineers worked day and night to build pontoon bridges, repair rail lines, and prepare crossing points for the massive assault. Ammunition stockpiles were stacked like miniature mountains, enough to sustain days of continuous bombardment. Fuel depots were hidden in forests, while mobile kitchens churned out simple meals for exhausted troops. The sheer scale was staggering. Entire armies had to be fed, supplied, and coordinated in synchronization. Soviet commanders knew that one logistical failure could paralyze the offensive at the critical moment. But the Red Army had learned through bitter experience the importance of supply, having advanced across thousands of kilometers since Stalingrad. The system was stretched, but it was ready for one last push. For Zhukov, the challenge was not only logistical, but also psychological. His soldiers had endured years of relentless combat, from the frozen trenches of Moscow to the ruined streets of Warsaw. They carried the scars of unimaginable suffering, yet also the determination to finish the job. Political officers reminded them daily of the atrocities committed by the Nazis in Soviet lands, fueling their desire for vengeance. Propaganda spread through leaflets, speeches, and songs, urging the men to avenge the millions of lives lost. The thought of planting the red banner over the Reichstag was more than just military, it was personal, even spiritual. The soldiers of the First Belarusian Front were told they would be remembered as the avengers of their people, but Zhukov also had to balance this thirst for vengeance with discipline, ensuring his men did not lose cohesion in their fury. The Red Army was now a battle-hardened force, but even hardened soldiers could break under the pressure of urban combat ahead. With Berlin so close, morale burned as hot as the artillery shells waiting to be fired. The Germans knew what was coming, and this weighed heavily on Zhukov's planning. Hitler had ordered Berlin to be defended at all costs, transforming the Seelow Heights into a fortress bristling with bunkers, trenches, and artillery. The defenders included remnants of elite units, Volkssturm militia, and SS fanatics, determined to hold out even against impossible odds. Zhukov was well aware that his opponent, General Gotthard Heinrici, was a master of defensive warfare. Heinrici had anticipated the Soviet assault, ordering his troops to withdraw from the forward lines just before bombardments, reducing casualties. This meant that Zhukov's artillery strikes might not inflict the devastating destruction he planned. Furthermore, spring rains had turned the flatlands before the heights into a swamp, threatening to bog down tanks and vehicles. Zhukov knew that every meter gained would be drenched in Soviet blood. Yet Stalin's expectations left him with no alternative. He had to strike head-on, regardless of cost. The battle would be decided by willpower as much as by firepower. In preparation for the offensive, Zhukov worked tirelessly with his staff, scrutinizing maps and aerial reconnaissance photos. He demanded constant updates on German troop positions, supply routes, and fortifications. Liaison officers ran messages day and night, while telegraph lines buzzed with coded orders. Zhukov himself exuded a relentless energy, driving his subordinates to match his pace. He was often described as uncompromising, even brutal, in his leadership style, unwilling to tolerate mistakes or hesitation. His presence at the front inspired confidence, but also fear, as soldiers knew the marshal expected nothing less than total commitment. Alongside him, commanders like Konstantin Rokossovsky and Ivan Konev prepared their own fronts, coordinating the massive encirclement of Berlin. Stalin, watching from Moscow, encouraged competition between Zhukov and Konev, promising glory to whichever reached the capital first. This rivalry pushed Zhukov to press harder, adding urgency to an already desperate timetable. The pressure to succeed weighed like a physical burden on every officer under his command. The scope of the Soviet buildup was unprecedented in European warfare. Nearly 2.5 million soldiers stood ready across the various fronts converging on Berlin. Artillery batteries stretched as far as the eye could see, their barrels aligned like a forest of steel. Tank brigades massed in hidden assembly areas, engines growling, waiting for the signal to advance. Overhead, the Soviet Air Force prepared for round-the-clock operations, tasked with ensuring the Luftwaffe would not disrupt the offensive. Signal units laid miles of telephone wires, ensuring that communication would not falter amid the chaos. Medical corps set up field hospitals, bracing for the tidal wave of wounded they knew would come. Cavalry units, though relics of another era, were still positioned for reconnaissance and rapid exploitation. Every component of the Red Army, from armored spearheads to rifle divisions, was aligned for one purpose: to break the German line and surge into Berlin. The sheer weight of men and machines promised devastation on an unimaginable scale. The battlefield itself seemed to tremble under the anticipation of what was to come. This said, by mid-April 1945, all was in place. Zhukov stood at the helm of a force, unparalleled in modern history, ready to deliver the final stroke of vengeance and victory. His plan, brutal in its simplicity, would unleash the full fury of Soviet artillery, smashing the German lines before waves of infantry surged forward. Behind them, armored columns would exploit the breach, driving relentlessly toward Berlin. Every hour of delay increased Stalin's impatience and intensified Zhukov's determination. For the soldiers on the front lines, there was no illusion of an easy victory. They knew the cost would be terrible. Yet they also knew that beyond the Seelow Heights lay the enemy's capital, the symbol of Nazi power and the heart of the war. The offensive would not only decide the fate of Berlin, but the fate of Europe itself. On the eve of the assault, Zhukov's voice rang across his command. The time of reckoning had arrived. The Red Army was ready to storm the gates of Berlin. By the spring of 1945, the German army on the Eastern Front was a shadow of its former self, battered, starving, and fragmented into desperate remnants. Yet into this hopeless situation stepped Colonel General Gotthard Heinrici, a man renowned not for fiery rhetoric, but for his cold, methodical brilliance in defensive warfare. Unlike many of Hitler's generals, Heinrici harbored no illusions about Germany's ability to achieve victory, but he understood the necessity of buying time. He studied the terrain with a surgeon's precision, identifying the Seelow Heights, a ridge overlooking the Oder River, as the ideal location for a last stand. His goal was not to stop the Red Army outright, for he knew that to be impossible, but to delay its advance and bleed it of men and material. With Berlin only 60 kilometers away, every hour gained meant one more day for civilians to flee, and for the Reich leadership to maneuver. His strategy was one of calculated sacrifice, designed to trade ground for time in a war already lost. While other commanders clung to Hitler's fantasy of counter-offensives, Heinrici quietly prepared a defensive masterpiece. He would turn the landscape itself into a weapon, flooding fields, reinforcing bunkers, and concealing artillery in forests. The battle to come would not be a clash of equal powers, but a grim demonstration of one man's ability to prolong the inevitable through sheer defensive genius. Heinrici was an unlikely savior of Berlin, a deeply religious Protestant who often prayed before battles and had little taste for Nazi ideology. He had earned a reputation earlier in the war for his ability to preserve men's lives by trading space instead of corpses, an approach often at odds with Hitler's obsession with holding ground at all costs. By April 1945, his army group Vistula numbered little more than 200,000 men, a fragile force facing nearly 2.5 million Soviet troops. Many of his soldiers were Volkssturm old men and boys pulled from the ruins of bombed cities, barely trained and armed with antiquated rifles or panzerfausts. Others were remnants of shattered divisions, weary veterans who had marched thousands of kilometers back from the gates of Moscow. Equipment was scarce, fuel was rationed, and the Luftwaffe had almost ceased to exist in the skies above. Yet Heinrici instilled discipline where despair threatened to take hold, organizing his men into layers of defenses rather than squandering them in futile frontal clashes. His mastery lay in timing withdrawals and ambushes, extracting maximum damage while minimizing his own losses. Though the odds were hopeless, his soldiers respected his clarity of purpose and his refusal to throw lives away recklessly. For the last defenders of the Reich, Heinrici was not a prophet of victory, but a commander who would give them a fighting chance to survive the storm. Hitler, ensconced in his Berlin bunker, demanded that the Oder River line be held to the last man, envisioning a rigid defense that ignored terrain realities. Heinrici, however, had no intention of obeying blindly. He anticipated where Zhukov's massive forces would strike, foreseeing the hammer blow aimed directly at Seelow Heights. Instead of defending the riverbank itself, he ordered his men to withdraw from the forward positions at the last possible moment, leaving the Soviets to waste their opening artillery barrages on empty trenches. Behind them, he had constructed multiple fallback lines, hidden gun emplacements, and carefully chosen kill zones. Swampy lowlands had been deliberately flooded by opening dikes, funneling Soviet tanks into narrow corridors where they would become easy targets. Villages were turned into strongpoints, every street barricaded, every cellar a machine gun nest. Even the smallest hills and ridges were fortified with overlapping fields of fire, creating a maze of death that would force the Red Army to pay dearly for every meter gained. Heinrici's refusal to sacrifice troops in Hitler's delusional stand-fast orders was an act of defiance cloaked in obedience. To his men, it was the difference between certain annihilation and the faint hope of survival. To the Soviets, it would prove a frustrating obstacle that threatened to derail their timetable. The men under Heinrici's command embodied the full spectrum of Germany's collapse. In one trench, a decorated veteran of Stalingrad huddled beside a 15-year-old conscript, barely able to lift his rifle. In another, an exhausted officer tried to drill farmers pressed into service after their villages were reduced to rubble. The Volkssturm were issued mismatched uniforms, some still bearing insignia from long-destroyed regiments, and often lacked helmets or boots. Yet Heinrici's system gave them roles that maximized their limited effectiveness. The boys and older men were stationed in rear positions or used as ammunition carriers, while the hardened veterans occupied the critical strongpoints. Morale was fragile, but Heinrici's calm leadership and meticulous planning gave these men a sense of purpose they otherwise lacked. Even the foreign volunteers, Hungarians, remnants of Waffen SS units, and scattered Baltic troops were folded into the line, their loyalty questioned but their manpower desperately needed. Heinrici knew the Soviets viewed these defenders as nothing more than obstacles on the road to Berlin, destined to be crushed. But he also knew that delaying the Red Army, even for a few days, could alter the tempo of the war's endgame. In his hands, desperation was forged into discipline, and defeat was transformed into resistance. As the Soviets amassed across the Oder, the scale of the impending battle became terrifyingly clear. Heinrici's intelligence officers reported thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft positioned opposite his weakened lines. The Red Army had concentrated its might like never before, preparing to blast through to Berlin in a single decisive offensive. Yet Heinrici calmly studied their formations and quietly prepared his countermeasures. He ordered camouflage nets to conceal what little armor he had, ensuring that every gun would fire from surprise. He carefully mapped out artillery ranges, ensuring overlapping barrages could catch Soviet infantry as they advanced. His engineers laid mines by the tens of thousands, turning meadows and roads into hidden traps. He reorganized supply depots into small scattered caches so that Soviet bombardments would not cripple his logistical chain. Even his communications were designed to be resilient, with redundant lines and runners prepared in case of radio silence. Heinrici knew he could not stop Zhukov's Juggernaut, but he could make it stagger, bleed, and crawl. For the weary men in the trenches, this preparation was a thin shield, but it was a shield nonetheless. Despite his defensive brilliance, Heinrici faced an impossible task. Hitler's interference remained constant, demanding counterattacks and forbidding withdrawals that were essential for survival. Heinrici, through subtle disobedience, circumvented these orders, often timing retreats just moments before Hitler's directives arrived at the front. His willingness to quietly defy the Führer was rare among German commanders, many of whom feared dismissal or worse. But Heinrici valued results over ideology, and he believed the only duty left was to prolong the fight, not to fulfill Hitler's fantasies. This put him at odds with SS units embedded within his command, who were more fanatically loyal to Hitler and less inclined to strategic withdrawals. Clashes of authority often erupted, with SS commanders demanding suicidal offensives, while Heinrici countered with cold logic. Yet in the chaos of Germany's final days, Heinrici's authority largely held respected even by men who distrusted his cautious approach. For his soldiers, he was a commander who did not waste them, who made every bullet and every trench line matter. In a war that had consumed millions of lives with reckless abandon, that alone earned him their loyalty. As April approached, Heinrici's soldiers braced for the storm, each man fully aware of the impossible odds they faced. Nights were filled with the distant thunder of Soviet artillery rehearsals, their guns testing ranges that would soon rain death upon German positions. The smell of damp earth mixed with the acrid stench of gasoline as engineers prepared fire traps and demolitions. Some soldiers wrote final letters home, though many had no families left to write to. Chaplains moved through the trenches, offering prayers to men who clutched rosaries, crosses, or faded photographs of wives and children. Heinrici himself walked the lines quietly, speaking to his soldiers in calm, measured tones, assuring them that their sacrifices were not meaningless. He did not promise survival or victory, only that they would face the enemy as soldiers, not victims. This honesty resonated more than any propaganda, giving men a strange sense of peace amidst despair. The defenders of Seelow Heights did not expect to live, but they expected to be remembered. Under Heinrici, their final battle would not be one of chaos, but of grim, deliberate resistance. Colonel General Gotthard Heinrici was no savior, nor did he claim to be. He was a realist at the twilight of a doomed Reich, commanding an army that could not win but could still fight. His genius was not in breaking the enemy, but in understanding how to bend without shattering, how to use terrain, timing, and human willpower to hold back the flood for as long as possible. The men who served him did so not because they believed in Hitler's Reich, but because they believed in Heinrici's leadership. When the Red Army finally launched its offensive, they would be waiting, dug in, disciplined, and prepared to inflict maximum pain. The fate of Berlin would be decided in days, But Heinrici would make every hour costly. In the ruins of Germany, his defensive brilliance would stand as one of the last displays of military professionalism in a war otherwise consumed by fanaticism. To the Soviets, he was a formidable obstacle, frustrating and costly. To the Germans, he was the commander who gave them a chance to fight with dignity in the final act. And to history, Heinrici remains the man who delayed the inevitable just long enough for the endgame to unfold. And Heinrici. As the Red Army prepared for its final push into the heart of Nazi Germany, the battlefield that lay before them was no ordinary ground. It was the Seelow Heights. Rising modestly from the flat expanses of the Oder River plain, these ridges stood as a natural fortress, offering those who held them a commanding view of the land below. The Oder River itself formed the first great obstacle, its waters swollen by spring rains and snowmelt, turning the floodplains into a swampy morass. The low-lying terrain between the river and the heights became a quagmire, where tanks would sink and infantry would struggle to advance. Every yard of ground seemed designed to punish an attacker. For the German defenders, this was the stage of their last great stand east of Berlin. For the Soviets, it was a deadly barrier that had to be overcome at any cost. The landscape was not simply geography, it was destiny. It would shape the tempo, the bloodshed, and the very outcome of the battle to come. The Seelow Heights stretched along a line roughly 30 miles long, a low escarpment that seemed insignificant on a map, but loomed large to anyone standing before it. Rising between 30 to 50 meters above the surrounding plain, the ridges provided unobstructed lines of fire for German artillery and machine guns. From their vantage point, the defenders could observe every Soviet movement across the Oder floodplain, turning advancing columns into easy targets. The villages scattered along the heights, such as Seelow, Dolgelin, and Müncheberg, were transformed into fortified bastions, each one prepared to be fought for house by house. Behind the ridges, fields and woods gave cover for secondary defensive positions, while the high ground allowed communication lines to remain intact. To the weary German troops clinging to hope, these modest elevations felt like the walls of a fortress protecting Berlin itself. They knew if the Soviets broke through here, there would be nothing left to stop them until the Reich's capital. And Favigons, the Oder River itself played a crucial role in the battlefield's deadly design. Flowing sluggishly through marshes and canals, it widened into a treacherous floodplain in springtime, making crossings perilous under fire. The Germans had deliberately destroyed bridges, leaving only a handful of crossings that could be easily targeted by artillery. To the east of the river, Soviet engineers faced the monumental task of ferrying millions of men, thousands of tanks, and endless supplies across makeshift pontoons. Night after night, they worked under moonlight, constructing floating bridges while German shells rained down upon them. The land between the river and the ridges became a kill zone, where advancing formations were trapped in mud, slowed by waterlogged fields, and shredded by fire from above. The Soviets knew that seizing Berlin would begin with conquering this swampy crucible, and they braced themselves for one of the bloodiest crossings of the war. Adding to the natural defenses, the Germans enhanced the terrain with meticulous preparation. Mines carpeted the fields and roads, while barbed wire entanglements forced attackers into predictable channels. Anti-tank ditches crisscrossed the floodplains, designed to swallow Soviet armor whole. Hidden bunkers were dug into the slopes of the ridges, camouflaged beneath earth and foliage, their gun ports ready to unleash deadly crossfire. Every farmhouse and barn was reinforced, becoming miniature fortresses from which soldiers could hold out for days. German engineers even diverted small streams to flood additional areas, creating artificial marshes to further bog down Soviet tanks. By April 1945, the Seelow Heights had been transformed into one of the most formidable defensive lines left in Europe. It was a fortress born of desperation, where every tree line, ditch, and mound of earth was bent into service for the Reich's survival. The villages scattered across the heights became pivotal anchors of defense. Seelow itself, a modest town of just a few thousand residents, was turned into a stronghold, with streets barricaded and cellars converted into firing positions. Dolgelin, Riefelde, and Müncheberg were similarly fortified, their medieval layouts of narrow lanes and stone buildings ideal for ambushes. Civilian homes were emptied of their families and filled with soldiers, ammunition, and machine guns. The heights behind these settlements allowed for artillery batteries to fire directly into the floodplain, pounding Soviet troops as they advanced through the mire. For the men defending them, these villages symbolized both protection and entrapment. They offered sturdy walls and good cover, but they were also surrounded, isolated points destined to be swallowed one by one. The battle for each village would be savage, a microcosm of the larger struggle between Nazi Germany's fading power and the Soviet Union's relentless advance. The weather added yet another brutal layer to the battlefield's complexity. April rains turned the already sodden floodplains into bottomless mud, where vehicles bogged down and soldiers sank knee-deep with every step. Tanks churned the ground into quagmires, making mobility a nightmare for attackers and defenders alike. Visibility was often shrouded by mist rising from the wetlands, giving cover for sudden ambushes but also confusing troop movements. For Soviet soldiers, the approach to the heights felt like wading through a swamp of death, every step exposed to German fire from above. For the defenders, the rain provided both an ally and an enemy. It slowed the Soviet advance but also hampered resupply efforts to their own positions. The clash between man, machine, and nature created an environment where survival was as much about endurance as it was about firepower. The Seelow Heights were not merely a battlefield but a living, hostile element shaping every moment of the struggle. From a distance, the Seelow Heights may have appeared unimposing, rolling ridges amid farmland and villages, but up close they were a nightmare. For Soviet infantry, the steep slopes meant climbing into the teeth of German defenses, all while under relentless machine gun fire. For Soviet tanks, the ridges were death traps, silhouetted targets for German anti-tank guns hidden in wooded groves. The very geography funneled advancing formations into predictable paths where German artillery could concentrate fire with devastating precision. Even as Soviet planes strafed and bombed, the terrain shielded many defensive positions, leaving attackers to fight for every inch. Soldiers would later recall the battlefield as an endless killing ground, where hills that seemed small on the horizon became towering barriers under fire. The Germans had turned the natural lay of the land into their final ally, and the Soviets would pay for every yard gained in blood. The Seelow Heights, with their ridges, marshes, and fortified villages, stood as the last true gateway to Berlin. They embodied the collision of geography, engineering, and human will, each shaping the fate of the battle that was to come. For Heinrici and his desperate defenders, the terrain offered a fleeting hope that they could delay the inevitable and buy time for their crumbling Reich. For Zhukov and the Soviet Juggernaut, it was a gauntlet that had to be smashed, no matter the cost, to open the road to Hitler's capital. The land itself became a character in the unfolding drama, unyielding, merciless, and indifferent to the suffering of the men who fought upon it. Every ridge, every ditch, and every swampy field would soon echo with the thunder of guns, the cries of the wounded, and the clash of armies in their final confrontation. In April 1945, the fate of Europe's greatest war turned not just on men and machines, but on the unforgiving terrain of the Seelow Heights. As the harsh winter of 1945 gave way to the thaw of spring, the Soviet Union prepared for the greatest offensive of the war, a hammer blow designed to crush the German capital and end the conflict in Europe. Along the banks of the Oder River, the Red Army gathered its might in a concentration of men and machines unlike anything the world had ever seen. This was not merely an attack, but a tidal wave of steel and fire, assembled with meticulous calculation to ensure Berlin's downfall. Troop movements stretched endlessly, columns of soldiers marching in relentless rhythm, their boots stamping the frozen earth into mud. Villages near the Oder became temporary camps, their fields transformed into seas of tents and ammunition stockpiles. Farmers' barns housed Soviet tanks, while roads were choked with supply convoys bringing shells, fuel, and rations. Night skies glowed red from the endless fires of field kitchens and repair stations working without pause. Engineers labored to build pontoon bridges, laying the groundwork for the coming assault across the river. The sheer scope of the preparation sent ripples of fear even into German command, who knew this massing was the harbinger of doom. The countdown to Berlin had begun, and the storm was gathering. The Soviet buildup on the Oder was not a reckless rush, but a carefully orchestrated masterpiece of logistics. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commanding the First Belarusian Front, ensured every unit was equipped for a battle of attrition. Supply depots grew into miniature cities, with mountains of shells stacked higher than houses and fuel drums lined in endless rows. Ammunition trains arrived in unbroken succession, their carriages filled with explosives that would soon rain devastation on German lines. Horses and trucks alike were pressed into service, dragging artillery pieces through churned mud to their firing positions. Each division was issued more munitions than it could carry, ensuring no lull would break the tempo of the offensive. Engineers mapped every road and track, calculating how to move entire armies with clockwork precision. Signals units set up elaborate communication networks, stretching wires through forests and across fields to maintain coordination. Soviet commanders understood that to smash Berlin, firepower and logistics had to move hand in hand. The preparation was clinical, massive, and merciless, designed to grind German defenses into dust. Every resource of the Soviet state was bent toward this one decisive push. The scale of manpower assembled was staggering, with millions of Soviet soldiers marshaled for the offensive. Zhukov commanded nearly 1 million men himself, while Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front massed another million to the south. Together they represented an unstoppable human tide, backed by over 40,000 artillery pieces and more than 7,000 tanks. The Red Army's infantry formed endless columns stretching to the horizon, hardened veterans mixed with fresh recruits eager to strike the final blow. Cavalry divisions, though fewer in number than in earlier years, were still deployed for reconnaissance and rapid strikes. Political officers roamed among the ranks, delivering fiery speeches about revenge, sacrifice, and the glory of victory. The men carried these words with them, etched into their minds as they prepared for the deadly tasks ahead. In dugouts and trenches, soldiers whispered about Berlin, imagining the ruined city that symbolized all the suffering they had endured. Others kept silent, clutching talismans or letters from home, their courage tempered by grim resolve. This was more than an army preparing for battle. It was the embodiment of the Soviet Union's will to destroy Nazism at its root. To stay tense, the artillery concentration along the Oder was a spectacle in itself, dwarfing any previous bombardment in the war. Rows of Katyusha rocket launchers waited silently, their rails glistening under spring rains, primed to unleash screaming salvos of fire. Heavy howitzers were dug into concealed positions, their barrels angled skyward, ready to rain shells onto the German defences of the Seelow Heights. Medium and light field guns were aligned with mathematical precision, every trajectory calculated to blanket the battlefield with iron. Each gun crew rehearsed endlessly, practicing loading and firing drills until they could execute them blindfolded. Shells were stockpiled so densely that officers joked the earth itself might collapse under their weight. Soviet planners intended to saturate every inch of German ground with fire, leaving nothing untouched, no bunker safe, no trench unscathed. The bombardment would be relentless, a storm of destruction designed to paralyze defenders before the infantry even advanced. When these guns roared together, the sound would shake the heavens and herald the final reckoning. The Soviets did not plan on mere superiority, they planned on overwhelming annihilation. The firepower assembled on the Oder was unlike anything Europe had ever witnessed. Tanks formed another critical pillar of the Soviet Juggernaut, massing in colossal numbers behind the infantry. From the legendary T-34 to the monstrous IS-2 heavy tanks, armored brigades lined the river in ranks that seemed endless. Soviet commanders had learned from earlier battles that tanks alone could not win. They had to move in harmony with infantry and artillery. To this end, armored spearheads were carefully positioned, ready to surge forward the moment the barrage lifted. Tank crews, veterans of Kursk and Operation Bagration, painted slogans of revenge and victory on their turrets. Mechanics worked tirelessly to keep the machines in perfect condition, replacing tracks, tuning engines, and ensuring every gun fired flawlessly. Fuel depots were established within striking distance, each one guarded fiercely, as tanks consumed thousands of liters each day. Camouflage nets draped over armored columns, hiding them from German reconnaissance aircraft, still brave enough to venture overhead. When the order came, these steel beasts would thunder across the Oder marshes, crushing everything in their path. Their presence was not only practical but psychological, instilling both confidence in Soviet troops and terror in German defenders. Air power too was concentrated with overwhelming force, as the Soviet Air Force prepared to dominate the skies over the Oder. Thousands of aircraft, from nimble Yak fighters to formidable P-2 bombers, filled makeshift airfields carved into fields and forests. Pilots were briefed on relentless sorties, tasked with both softening German defences and ensuring no Luftwaffe remnants could interfere. Supply convoys delivered bombs and fuel without pause, creating stockpiles that promised continuous air cover. Soviet reconnaissance planes flew ceaselessly, photographing German positions and feeding intelligence back to command posts. Pilots trained for close support missions, learning to strike with precision alongside advancing infantry and tanks. Many carried with them the memory of comrades lost in earlier air battles, their determination sharpened by years of attrition. Anti-aircraft units accompanied the Soviet advance, ensuring German counterattacks would be met with deadly flak. For the Soviets, the air war was no longer about survival, it was about dominance, the assurance that Berlin would fall under skies owned by the Red Army. As the days ticked down, the roar of engines overhead became as constant as the rumble of artillery on the ground. Behind the front lines, the Soviet buildup created an atmosphere of anticipation and dread, a collective holding of breath before the storm. Soldiers drilled endlessly, rehearsing assaults, digging foxholes, and hauling ammunition crates to the front. Civilians in captured villages watched in awe and fear as entire fields disappeared under the weight of armored columns. Command posts buzzed with activity, maps spread across tables, radios crackling with coded transmissions. Commissars delivered speeches about vengeance for the millions of Soviet dead, igniting fervor in men already driven by exhaustion and rage. campfires flickered through the night, illuminating the faces of soldiers who smoked in silence, their eyes fixed on the looming Seelow Heights. Rumors spread of the Germans' desperate defenses, of minefields and hidden bunkers waiting across the river. Yet the soldiers knew their numbers and firepower far outweighed anything the enemy could muster. As the days shortened into hours, the Red Army's heartbeat quickened, a vast machine ready to lurch into motion. The buildup was complete, and only the final order remained. Neither panned so far. By early April 1945, the Soviet concentration on the Oder had reached its zenith, an unstoppable war machine crouched like a predator before its final strike. The quiet before the offensive was deceptive, broken only by the clatter of supply wagons and the distant growl of artillery practice. Zhukov and Konev finalized their plans, their armies poised to race each other to Berlin in a contest of glory and vengeance. German reconnaissance reported the massing with horror, knowing they faced annihilation yet powerless to halt it. For the soldiers of the Red Army, the moment carried both destiny and dread, an end to years of brutal struggle, but at a cost they could not yet imagine. The Oder's banks, swollen with spring waters, seemed almost to tremble under the weight of men and steel. Fields were scarred with trenches, ditches, and artillery pits, transforming the landscape into a launch pad of destruction. Every soldier knew what awaited across the river, the gateway to Berlin, guarded by desperation and blood. The countdown had ended, and the storm was ready to break. The battle for Berlin was about to begin, forged in fire and fury on the banks of the Oder. Dawn broke over the Oder River valley on April 16, 1945, not with the gentle light of a spring morning, but with a thunder that shook the earth itself. At precisely 3 a.m., the Red Army unleashed what would become the largest artillery barrage of the entire Second World War. Thousands of Soviet guns, mortars, and Katyusha rocket launchers roared to life simultaneously, their muzzles belching flame as the night sky turned into a blinding storm of fire. The shockwave of sound rolled across the marshes and ridges of the Seelow Heights, a deafening wall of noise that shattered windows in villages miles away. Soldiers on both sides described the earth trembling as though the ground itself was cracking apart. To the Germans huddled in bunkers and foxholes, the sky seemed to fall down upon them in an unending rain of steel. For the Soviets, this was the overture to the last and bloodiest act of the war in Europe. Entire battalions of guns fired in prearranged rhythms, covering every suspected German position. Villages along the front vanished under rolling curtains of explosions. The night was alive with a constant rumble, as if 1,000 thunderstorms had converged upon the Oder. The Soviet artillery had been carefully prepared for weeks, its positions hidden among forests, camouflaged behind embankments, and reinforced with elaborate supply lines to keep shells flowing without pause. Georgy Zhukov, orchestrating the assault, ordered that fire be concentrated in such density that nothing in front of the Seelow Heights would survive. In less than an hour, more than 1 million shells and rockets were hurled at the German lines, a deluge of destruction unparalleled even by the standards of the Eastern Front. Observation planes circled overhead, guiding the gunners onto suspected bunkers, strongpoints, and crossroads. To the west, German trenches were torn open, and the cries of the wounded merged with the endless roar of bombardment. Yet not all positions were destroyed. Deep bunkers dug into the chalky ridges of the heights absorbed much of the punishment. Heinrici's foresight had ensured that frontline German troops were pulled back at the last moment, leaving Soviet shells to fall on largely empty forward trenches. It was a bitter irony. The largest bombardment in history fell heaviest on the ground itself, not the defenders. Still, the devastation to roads, communication lines and morale was enormous. For the German soldiers who remained, the experience was one of pure terror and helplessness. Men crouched in underground shelters, clutching their helmets as dust and debris fell in choking clouds around them. The ground shuddered with each explosion, and many believed that the Soviets had unleashed a new kind of weapon. Communications lines were cut, radios destroyed, and runners killed before they could deliver orders. At forward observation posts, entire platoons were wiped out in seconds. Those caught in the open, truck drivers, sentries, or units unlucky enough to be in exposed trenches, were simply obliterated, their bodies torn apart by shrapnel. The psychological impact was immense. Even hardened veterans of the Eastern Front admitted that they had never experienced such a display of raw firepower. It was not simply artillery, it was the physical embodiment of Soviet industrial might, roaring with the promise of final vengeance. In Berlin, miles away, civilians reported hearing a low rolling thunder in the east, a grim foreshadowing of the storm about to consume them. The Soviet infantry, massed in staggering numbers behind the guns, were poised to surge forward as the barrage lifted. Zhukov had arranged for entire armies to stand ready. Men from Siberia, Central Asia, and the Ukraine, each carrying rifles, submachine guns, and grenades, waiting in the damp darkness of the Oder floodplain. Behind them rumbled the armored fist of the Red Army. Hundreds of T-34, AS-2 heavy tanks, and self-propelled artillery. Their engines growled, exhaust fumes mixing with the acrid stench of burning powder. Soldiers peered across the smoke-filled no-man's land toward the ridges, expecting to find little resistance after such a storm of shells. Yet Heinrici's defensive withdrawal had created a deadly trap. When the barrage lifted, and the Soviet soldiers surged forward at dawn, they discovered not an obliterated enemy, but concealed German positions waiting on higher ground. Machine guns opened up from carefully camouflaged bunkers. Artillery observers called in fire from batteries untouched by the bombardment. The Soviet gamble for a rapid breakthrough would turn into a grinding slaughter. As the first Soviet waves splashed across the flooded flats of the Oder, they encountered obstacles deliberately prepared by the Germans. The low-lying terrain had been inundated by water from destroyed dams, creating mud-choked marshes that bogged down infantry and made the advance excruciatingly slow. Men slipped and fell, weighed down by ammunition, sinking into knee-deep muck as German shells burst around them. Pontoon bridges, hastily constructed in the days before the assault, became prime targets for German gunners who fired with ruthless precision. Entire units were cut apart on these crossings, men and equipment tumbling into the cold waters below. Tanks tried to push forward, but many sank in the soft ground or became easy targets for anti-tank guns. The artillery barrage had failed to silence many of these German guns, and now they spoke with deadly accuracy. Every yard gained by the Soviets was paid for in blood, as dawn revealed a battlefield littered with craters, bodies, and burning vehicles. In the Soviet command posts, frustration quickly mounted. Zhukov had promised Stalin a swift breakthrough at Seelow, boasting that his armies would be in Berlin within days. Yet by mid-morning on April 16th, it was clear that the Germans had not broken. Reports flooded in of heavy resistance, of whole divisions pinned down by machine gun fire, of tanks stuck in the marshes. Zhukov, under enormous pressure, ordered his men to press forward at all costs. Soviet commanders, desperate to fulfill their orders, hurled regiment after regiment into the storm, hoping sheer numbers would overwhelm the defenders. But Heinrici's calculated defense was working as intended. Every advance slowed, every attack faltered, and Soviet losses mounted into the tens of thousands within hours. The very strategy that had won Zhukov his victories at Moscow, Stalingrad and Kursk now seemed to betray him, as frontal assault met prepared defense in the most punishing of terrains. For the Germans, the opening barrage was both terrifying and strangely reassuring. They had survived the worst that the Soviets could unleash, and now the battlefield tilted in their favor. From the ridges of the Seelow Heights, German artillery spotted Soviet troop concentrations with deadly clarity. Panzerfast teams stalked the mud, destroying tanks at close range. Villages like Dolgolin and Seelow itself became fortresses, every street a killing ground, every house a bunker. The Luftwaffe, though a shadow of its former self, managed a few sorties, strafing Soviet columns caught in the open. Yet despite these tactical successes, the defenders knew they were living on borrowed time. The Soviet Juggernaut was simply too vast, too determined, and too well supplied. Each German victory was fleeting, a delay rather than a salvation. Still, in those first hours of April 16th, the German soldiers believed they had done the impossible, withstood the fury of the largest bombardment in history. As night fell on the first day of battle, the landscape of Seelow was transformed into a vision of hell. Entire forests were reduced to skeletal stumps. Villages lay in smoking ruins. The marshes were filled with shattered tanks, the corpses of men and horses, and the wreckage of pontoon bridges. The Soviets had advanced only a few miles at a staggering cost of tens of thousands of casualties. The Germans, though battered, still held the key defensive ridges. For Zhukov it was a bitter humiliation. His meticulously planned artillery storm had failed to achieve the breakthrough. For Heinrici it was a grim vindication of his defensive genius. Yet both sides knew the battle was far from over. This was only the opening act of a struggle that would stretch on for 3 more days, consuming men, machines, and entire landscapes in its fury. The storm had begun, but its true fury was still to come. As the first grey light of April 16th spread over the Oder Valley, the battlefield was swallowed in an eerie, suffocating fog. The Soviets had counted on their titanic bombardment to clear the way, but nature itself conspired against their plans. The thick mist rolled in from the river and marshes, blanketing fields, woods, and ridges in a ghostly shroud. Soviet spotters could barely make out silhouettes a few dozen meters ahead, rendering their carefully calibrated artillery corrections almost useless. Tank commanders straining to see often drove blind into obstacles, craters, and even German minefields hidden beneath the haze. Infantrymen advanced nervously, their rifles clutched tightly, unable to see the defenses they were told had been pulverized. Instead of charging into a broken enemy line, they stumbled into uncertainty. The fog-muffled sound, turning distant machine gun bursts into vague echoes and confusing advancing formations. Every step forward carried the sense of walking into a trap, and for the Germans it was exactly that. Behind the veil of fog, Colonel General Heinrici's defenses revealed their sinister ingenuity. He had deliberately pulled his frontline troops back during the Soviet bombardment, ensuring that the storm of fire fell largely on empty positions. When the Soviet infantry surged forward, they found trenches vacant and bunkers abandoned, eerily silent in the smoke. Then, as the fog concealed their approach, German machine gun nests suddenly erupted from unexpected angles, catching Red Army soldiers in deadly crossfire. Soviet units, already disoriented, scattered for cover, only to run into carefully laid minefields. Each explosion tore gaps in their formations and slowed the advance further. Mortar shells, pre-sighted on key choke points, rained down with unnerving precision. The Germans had mastered the art of elastic defense, absorbing the Soviet blow and then bleeding the attackers. In the fog, this method became devastatingly effective, transforming the battlefield into a death trap. For Marshal Zhukov, the situation was both infuriating and bewildering. His staff officers, expecting rapid breakthroughs, received contradictory reports from the front. Some divisions claimed progress of a kilometre or more, while others reported being pinned down by stubborn German fire. Communication lines were tangled, radios jammed or destroyed, and field telephones cut by shelling. Frustration mounted as commanders demanded reinforcements, certain that just one more push would shatter the enemy line. Yet each push was swallowed by fog and gunfire, leaving hundreds of men sprawled across the sodden fields. Zhukov himself, peering through binoculars from his command post, could see little more than a shifting wall of mist and smoke. His artillery had promised annihilation, yet the German defences seemed alive and unbroken. It was a bitter reminder that overwhelming firepower alone could not guarantee swift victory against a determined and cunning foe. The end. On the ground, Soviet infantrymen paid the price for this miscalculation. Advancing in dense formations meant to exploit what was believed to be a shattered front. They became easy targets. German machine guns, hidden in cleverly camouflaged pillboxes, raked them with withering bursts. Entire companies were cut down in minutes, their bodies littering the churned earth. The fog made flanking maneuvers nearly impossible. Squads often became separated and lost. Officers desperate to maintain cohesion shouted themselves hoarse, only to draw German fire. Tanks, attempting to lead the charge, bogged down in mud, or were struck by concealed anti-tank guns, their silhouettes easy prey against the whiteness of the mist. In one harrowing stretch of battlefield, Soviet engineers desperately cleared mines under fire, only to be mowed down before completing paths. It was war reduced to its rawest brutality, confusion, chaos, and blood, all cloaked by nature's hand. Meanwhile, the German defenders, though vastly outnumbered, fought with the grim determination of men who knew there was nowhere left to fall back. Heinrici's orders had been clear. Trade space for blood. Every metre gained by the Soviets would be bought with heavy casualties. Machine gunners held their fire until Soviet troops were at point-blank range, then unleashed sudden devastation before slipping to secondary positions. Mortar crews worked with relentless efficiency, firing until their barrels glowed. Even Volkssturm militia and Hitler Youth units, poorly trained and scarcely armed, contributed to the deadly resistance by acting as runners, spotters, or snipers in village ruins. German officers rotated their men between front-line fire positions and nearby dugouts to prevent collapse from exhaustion. What they lacked in numbers and weapons, they compensated with preparation and ruthless tactical cunning. To the Soviets, it felt like fighting a phantom army that appeared and vanished with the fog. The Soviet Air Force, which should have been a decisive factor, found itself paralyzed by the weather. Low visibility grounded many squadrons, while those that did take off often failed to locate targets or mistakenly bombed friendly positions. Pilots circled aimlessly, searching for landmarks obscured by fog and smoke. In the meantime, German flak batteries remained hidden, conserving ammunition until opportunities presented themselves. Soviet artillery, unable to adjust fire accurately, poured shells into empty spaces, wasting ammunition at an alarming rate. The promise of total dominance, the crushing power of overwhelming numbers, was slipping into the quagmire of Seelow. Frustrated Soviet commanders grew reckless, ordering renewed frontal assaults simply to keep momentum alive. The result was a mounting toll of dead and wounded, clogging the already narrow approaches to the heights. The fog had become not only a natural shield for the Germans, but also a silent killer for the Soviets. By midday, it was clear that the Soviet timetable for victory was unraveling. Zhukov had promised Stalin that Berlin would fall quickly, but at Seelow Heights, even the first barrier proved far more resilient than expected. The fog slowly began to lift in patches, revealing to Soviet soldiers the grim panorama of their losses. Fields strewn with bodies, wrecked tanks burning like pyres, and whole battalions decimated in the mire. German defenders, emboldened by their success, counterattacked in small but sharp thrusts, pushing Soviet infantry back from critical positions. Supply columns trying to bring ammunition forward were shelled mercilessly by German artillery, further disrupting the advance. Soviet morale wavered under the weight of frustration and carnage. What was supposed to be a decisive hammer blow had turned into a bloody slog. The Red Army was advancing, yes, but at a pace measured in meters, not kilometers. As night fell on April 16th, the first day of the assault, both sides reckoned with the staggering cost. The Soviets had thrown everything into breaking the German line, yet Seelow Heights still stood. Thousands of Red Army soldiers lay dead or wounded, their sacrifice buying little tangible ground. German forces, though battered, still clung to their ridges and villages, grimly determined to hold out another day. The fog that had shielded them in the morning was gone, replaced by smouldering ruins and fields illuminated by burning wreckage. For Zhukov, the setback was intolerable, yet retreat was not an option. More men, more tanks, and more shells would be thrown into the fight. For Heinrici, the day was a triumph of discipline and defensive mastery, though he knew his troops could not withstand the Soviet tide indefinitely. The stage was set for the brutal days to follow, where fog and fire would give way to the grinding clash of attrition. The battlefield east of the Seelow Heights had transformed into a nightmare landscape, one forged by both nature and man. Heavy spring rains and deliberate German flooding of the Oder lowlands had turned fields into vast swamps, where every step threatened to suck men into the mud. Minefields had been scattered across these wetlands, hidden beneath water and reeds, waiting to explode beneath boot or track. Soviet soldiers, carrying rifles above their heads, waded chest-deep into icy water, their ammunition packs soaked, their heavy uniforms dragging them down. German machine guns, mounted on elevated dikes and hidden tree lines, scythed across the advancing waves, cutting soldiers down as they struggled forward. The very earth itself seemed hostile, swallowing men into bogs that became graves. Smoke from the artillery barrage mixed with ground mist, creating a choking haze where silhouettes flickered and vanished. The front lines dissolved into confusion, where cries of the wounded echoed across the marshes. Every advance cost blood, and every gain of a few meters seemed to demand entire companies. Here in the drowned no man's land, the Soviet Juggernaut met its cruelest test. WW2 engineers, the unsung heroes of the Red Army, moved ahead of the infantry, crawling through mud to clear mines with bare hands and crude detectors. They worked in near silence, probing the ground with bayonets, while tracer fire zipped overhead and mortar rounds splashed into the swamps. When they found a mine, they marked it with scraps of cloth or sticks, often under fire, buying safe passage for those behind. Some carried heavy wooden planks, laying makeshift paths over the waterlogged earth, only to see them shattered moments later by explosions. Many did not survive, their bodies torn apart while clearing the way for others. Yet for each one who fell, another crawled forward, grimly determined to fulfill their duty. The Soviets knew they could not outflank this stretch of land. They had to pass through it. Stalin's demand for speed and Zhukov's urgency left no room for delay. Thus the engineers advanced, bleeding in silence, to pave the path for the divisions behind them. For the infantrymen slogging through the marshes, the battle was unlike anything they had trained for. Machine gun nests, cunningly placed on raised ground, fired in deadly arcs, their tracers streaking like fiery ribbons across the fog. Every ripple in the water seemed to conceal danger. A mine, a sniper's bullet, or the sudden burst of a mortar shell. The Soviets advanced in waves, clinging to clumps of earth, ducking into shallow pools, and returning fire whenever they could see muzzle flashes. But visibility was poor, the fog and smoke turning the battlefield into a shadowy labyrinth. Soldiers often fired blindly, convinced they were suppressing a position, only to discover later that the real guns were still intact. Hand grenades became essential, thrown into patches of reeds where Germans might be concealed. Bayonets were fixed, and rifles clutched tightly, for the marshes dissolved battle lines into intimate, brutal confrontations. The fighting became personal, faces glimpsed at arm's length, screams drowned in mud and smoke, death delivered in silence. German defenders, though outnumbered, used every advantage of terrain to amplify their strength. Heinrici's foresight had ensured that this zone was not merely flooded but weaponized, its geography turned into a fortress without walls. Machine guns were positioned to create overlapping kill zones, ensuring that no Soviet advance went unpunished. Mortars, hidden in barns and shallow dugouts, dropped shells into the bogs where advancing soldiers clustered. Snipers, perched in the upper floors of ruined cottages, picked off officers and radio men with deadly precision. Even small groups of German soldiers, sometimes no more than a squad, held up battalions for hours by ambushing from dikes and ridges. The terrain magnified their courage, allowing them to fight far beyond their numbers. The Germans did not expect victory, but they intended to exact a price in blood. Each delay, each hour gained, was a gift to Berlin, and so they fought like men already condemned, determined to drag their enemies down into the swamp with them. Attrition. Hand-to-hand combat became inevitable, as Soviet soldiers reached the scattered German outposts that dotted the marshes. In the fog and reeds, firefights collapsed into grappling struggles, where bayonets clashed and rifle butts swung like clubs. Soldiers drowned one another in pools of mud, the water turning red as both attacker and defender slipped beneath its surface. Soviet submachine guns rattled at close range, cutting through squads at mere meters. Germans countered with Panzerfausts, blasting apart makeshift rafts and log bridges carrying men and supplies. The proximity erased the distinction between front and rear. Anyone still alive was a combatant, forced to fight or die. Prisoners were rare, for in the chaos of the marshes, mercy was a luxury no one could afford. Both sides fought with a desperation that turned every encounter into a small apocalypse. The Seelow marshes became not just a battlefield but a killing ground where civilization seemed to vanish, replaced only by primal survival. Artillery fire, meant to suppress the defenders, often did as much harm to the attackers. Soviet guns thundered from the eastern banks of the Oder, their shells whistling across the battlefield, exploding in fountains of water and mud. But the accuracy was limited, for the smoke and fog made spotting targets nearly impossible. Entire batteries wasted ammunition bombarding empty patches of reeds, while German strongpoints remained untouched. Worse still, many shells fell short, crashing among Soviet formations already struggling through the marshes. Men who had trusted the firepower of the Red Army now feared it as much as German fire. Yet, despite the confusion, the barrage never ceased, the sky constantly trembling with thunder. For soldiers wading through waist-deep water, every explosion felt like the earth itself was collapsing. The psychological toll was immense, as exhaustion and terror gnawed at their will. Still, the relentless Soviet tide pushed forward, inch by bloody inch. As day wore on, the marshes became a graveyard. Bodies floated in pools, faces half submerged, weapons still clutched in lifeless hands. The mud swallowed men whole, leaving behind only helmets or boots as markers of their final moments. Equipment was abandoned, machine guns stuck in muck, tanks bogged down to their turrets, horses drowned beside shattered carts. The cries of the wounded echoed without pause, some trapped and slowly sinking while comrades were unable to reach them. Medical units struggled to keep pace, their stretchers sinking with every step, their bandages soaked through by filthy water. The air reeked of cordite, mud and blood, a stench that clung to every breath. Exhaustion blurred the faces of soldiers, their eyes hollow with shock as they pressed forward. No victory seemed possible here, only survival, and yet the Soviets, bound by discipline, fear and sheer momentum, refused to stop. The marshes consumed thousands, but still the assault did not break. By nightfall, the no-man's land between the Oder and Seelow Heights was littered with detritus of war. Fires flickered in the mist, casting ghostly shadows over a landscape that looked more like hell than earth. The Soviet advance had not broken the German line, but it had forced a wedge into its outer defences. Heinrici's plan had worked. He had slowed the Red Army, bleeding them heavily before they even touched the fortified heights. Yet for Zhukov, failure was not an option. Orders were barked to prepare for renewed assaults at dawn, no matter the cost. Soldiers shivered in their waterlogged uniforms, gripping rifles as they awaited the next wave. The Marshes had already claimed thousands of lives, and more would surely follow. But behind them stood millions of men and thousands of guns, an unstoppable tide. The Marshes were not the end, only the beginning of the storm that would consume Seelow Heights. The ridgelines of the Seelow Heights were no longer silent slopes of earth and farmland, but transformed into fiery fortresses of resistance. As the first Soviet waves clawed their way out of the sodden marshes, they were met with withering curtains of fire from German strongpoints hidden along the crests. Every rise concealed dugouts, camouflaged bunkers, and cleverly placed 88mm guns that unleashed shells with surgical precision against advancing armor. Panther tanks, dug into hull-down positions, appeared like steel predators emerging from the earth itself, their long-barreled cannons tearing through Soviet T-34 Sears with deadly accuracy. The air was thick with dust, cordite, and screams as each Soviet advance was shredded, forcing entire regiments to flatten themselves into the mud. Heinrici's defensive vision had turned the Seelow Heights into a wall of fire, each strongpoint linked to overlapping fields of fire that trapped attackers in kill zones. Soviet artillery, even after hours of bombardment, had barely dented these hidden defenses, leaving their gunners blind to exact positions. The defenders, though exhausted and under strength, fought with a fanatical determination, as if Berlin itself lay directly beneath their boots. Machine gun nests stitched death across every dip in the terrain, while mortars rained high-angle fire into Soviet staging grounds. This was no mere delaying action. It was a deliberate stand to bleed the Red Army white before they could reach the German capital. The German defensive network along the ridges was a masterpiece of layered fortifications, built not with abundance but with ingenuity born of desperation. Each ridge bristled with concealed positions, where sandbags, tree trunks, and collapsed farmhouses had been converted into firing platforms. Anti-tank ditches carved into the slopes forced Soviet armor into predictable paths where waiting gunners destroyed them with precision. The 88 guns, relics of earlier victories, still proved devastating, their shells cracking open T-34 turrets like eggshells in explosive flashes. The Panthers, though few in number, were employed like mobile artillery, relocating between camouflaged hollows and unleashing sudden volleys before vanishing back under nets and branches. Even the civilian Volkssturm, armed with little more than Panzerfausts, used the terrain to deadly effect, ambushing tanks in gullies and from barns. Every destroyed Soviet machine became not just wreckage, but an obstacle, clogging the narrow passes and stalling the flow of fresh reinforcements. Heinrici's foresight had ensured that the Soviet advantage in numbers was blunted at every turn, forcing them into costly frontal assaults. The German soldiers knew retreat was impossible, so they clung to each bunker with grim resolve, their willpower hardened by fear of what awaited their families in Berlin. The ridges, steeped in fire and blood, became an arena where every meter gained was paid for in hundreds of lives. At dawn's edge, Soviet tanks crested the marshy approaches, only to find themselves silhouetted against the horizon, perfect targets for German gunners lying in wait. Panther crews, trained to fire at long distances, zeroed in with deadly calm, igniting the leading Soviet machines before they could even traverse their turrets. Each hit sent towering flames into the morning sky, the explosions visible for kilometers across the Oder Valley. Infantrymen diving from the burning hulks found no safety in the mud, as machine gun fire chewed through reeds and earth with merciless precision. Even as Soviet artillery intensified, hurling shells in rolling waves across the heights, the defenders endured inside their dugouts, emerging only when the barrage lifted. The Germans had become masters of timing, knowing when to vanish beneath earthworks and when to rise in orchestrated volleys of fire. Soviet commanders, frustrated by their inability to pinpoint targets, ordered massed infantry assaults, but each charge was shattered on the ridgeline like waves against cliffs. Hand-to-hand fighting broke out in isolated breaches, but German counterattacks with grenades and flamethrowers drove the Soviets back into the gullies below. Smoke covered the battlefield like a shifting curtain, yet the Germans seemed to know every path, every fold of the land, exploiting it with surgical cruelty. For the Soviets, it was a nightmare of fire and steel, a killing ground that seemed endless. The roar of battle was constant, a rolling thunder punctuated by the sharp crack of rifles and the deeper concussions of heavy guns. Soviet artillery fired at maximum intensity, creating craters large enough to swallow squads, but the Germans had dug in too deep, their bunkers reinforced with timber and earth. When a shell did find its mark, entire positions vanished in clouds of soil and blood, but for every bunker destroyed, another opened fire from an unseen angle. The battlefield became a deadly puzzle, where each solved piece only revealed new layers of resistance. Soviet engineers tried to bridge anti-tank ditches under fire, dragging logs and steel across the gaps, but German mortars rained shells upon them, scattering their efforts in seconds. Tanks bogged down in the mud became easy prey for lurking Volkssturm fighters, who darted forward with Panzerfausts, firing point-blank before vanishing into ruins. The defenders, though battered, fought with a unity of purpose, driven by a mixture of discipline, desperation, and fatalism. The closer the Soviets came, the fiercer the resistance became, as though the very ridges themselves were infused with the last breath of the Reich. It was not merely defense, it was a defiant act of survival against overwhelming inevitability. By midday, the Soviet commanders understood the heights would not fall quickly, no matter how much fire they poured into them. Among the most feared weapons of the German defense were the 88 guns, their barrels camouflaged beneath nets and foliage. Originally designed as anti-aircraft weapons, these versatile cannons had become tank killers par excellence, their shells capable of piercing even the heaviest Soviet armor. Soviet crews dreaded the sudden thunder of an 88, followed by the catastrophic eruption of fire as a shell tore through their vehicle. Entire platoons of tanks advanced only to be gutted in seconds, leaving the survivors to retreat in chaos. The gunners, veterans hardened from years of fighting on multiple fronts, operated with machine-like precision, their positions carefully chosen to maximize visibility over killing fields. The Soviets attempted to smother these guns with massed artillery, but their mobility allowed crews to shift positions under cover, reappearing to strike again. Even as Soviet planes swooped in for strafing runs, the guns swiveled skyward, blasting aircraft from the sky with the same deadly accuracy. This dual purpose made every 88 a terror, holding back not just tanks but infantry too, who feared being cut down as they advanced. The psychological toll was immense, as soldiers began to hesitate, crouching low in mud-filled craters, unsure of where the next strike would come from. Against such weapons, sheer numbers alone were not enough. Every advance demanded sacrifice. The terrain itself favored the defenders, each ridge serving as a natural wall that broke Soviet momentum. Soviet tanks churned up the marshes, their tracks clogged with mud, slowing their progress and exposing them as stationary targets. Infantry advancing in shallow waves found themselves funneled into low valleys where German guns had been zeroed in days before. Minefields littered the approaches, exploding in brutal sprays that dismembered men and machines alike, creating choke points where fresh units stumbled into chaos. Villages scattered across the ridges were transformed into fortresses, every building a sniper's nest, every cellar a bunker, and every street a gauntlet of fire. Soviet troops fought room to room, often blasting through walls with explosives to avoid ambushes at doorways, only to be met with grenades tossed down stairwells. For the Germans, even ruins became weapons, their jagged edges turned into defensive cover. Barbed wire, hidden under shallow water, tripped advancing soldiers, leaving them exposed to merciless fire from above. Every meter of land felt like a trap, a cruel maze designed to bleed invaders dry before they reached the summit. The heights were no longer just terrain, they had become a crucible where both armies bled for dominance. Despite exhaustion, the German defenders fought with a grim determination that bordered on suicidal resolve. Many had nothing left to fight for but the city behind them, Berlin, where their families and homes awaited either salvation or destruction. Heinrici had instilled in them the importance of holding every ridge for as long as possible, knowing each hour bought precious time for what little remained of the Reich's defenses. The soldiers, many of them young boys and old men, gritted their teeth as they loaded rifles and panzerfausts, refusing to abandon their posts even when surrounded. Veterans of the Eastern Front, hardened by years of retreat, now fought as if they had finally reached their last battlefield, where retreat was no longer an option. Propaganda had fueled their fears of Soviet vengeance, convincing them that surrender meant certain death or worse. This fear turned into fuel, a dark energy that bound them to their weapons with an almost religious fervor. When Strongpoints fell, survivors regrouped in new positions, fighting on with rifles scavenged from the dead. Even as ammunition dwindled, the defenders held fast, their resistance becoming more feral the closer the Soviets pushed. To them, the Seelow Heights were not merely a battlefield but the final shield of their world. By the end of the first day's assault, the Seelow Heights remained firmly in German hands, though the ground below was littered with wreckage and corpses. Soviet forces had advanced only a fraction of what their commanders had expected, their attacks slowed to a crawl by fierce resistance. The ridges smoked under constant bombardment, Yet the Strongpoints still spat fire into the advancing waves. Soviet generals seethed with frustration, their belief in overwhelming numbers faltering against the reality of German engineering and determination. Zhukov, confident of a breakthrough, now faced the humiliating truth that even with the largest offensive force in history, the ridges had not been cracked. For the Germans, it was a grim triumph, proof that their defences could hold against the Red Army's fury, if only temporarily. Every hour gained was an hour closer to reinforcing Berlin, even if only in illusion. Yet beneath the defiance lay the undeniable truth: the Soviets would not stop, and every German victory on the ridges was soaked in irreplaceable blood. The Seelow Heights had erupted in fire, but the storm had only begun. The defenders had held for now, but the cost on both sides foreshadowed a battle that would descend into even greater carnage. In the spring of 1945, as the thunder of guns shook the Oder front, another battle was being waged behind the lines, one not of steel or fire but of ambition and prestige. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, hero of Moscow, Stalingrad, and Kursk, had been entrusted with the central thrust toward Berlin. Yet to his south, Marshal Ivan Konev, equally ruthless and eager for glory, commanded the First Ukrainian Front, with orders to push toward Saxony and Dresden, and if possible, to break into Berlin itself. Joseph Stalin, ever the manipulator, deliberately set these two titans on converging paths, calculating that their rivalry would accelerate the destruction of Germany. Zhukov, proud and blunt, knew he carried the symbolic weight of storming Hitler's capital, yet he also sensed the shadow of Konev creeping closer with every kilometer. Konev, ambitious and cunning, had no intention of playing second to his northern counterpart. He believed he could reach Berlin first, snatching the laurels of final victory. The tension between them was palpable, whispered among officers, debated in the Kremlin, and ultimately woven into the very planning of the operation. Stalin, sitting in Moscow, held the reins, prodding his generals forward like chess pieces on a blood-soaked board. The battle for Berlin, already the most massive military confrontation in history, was now layered with intrigue and competition at the very top. In the end, it would not only be fought with tanks and artillery, but with pride, politics, and Stalin's iron grip on power. Marshal Zhukov's plan for the assault on the Seelow Heights was shaped as much by the battlefield as by Stalin's impatience. The supreme leader demanded swift results, wanting Berlin captured before the Western Allies could make their final push across the Elbe. Zhukov, cautious yet pressured, promised a rapid breakthrough, banking on overwhelming artillery firepower and sheer mass of men and machines to sweep the Germans aside. Yet the opening days revealed a different reality, as fog, minefields, and Heinrichi's defences slowed the advance to a crawl. Stalin's reaction was immediate and sharp. His telegrams seethed with veiled threats and criticism. To Stalin, delay was weakness, and weakness was betrayal. Behind every order and every maneuver loomed the fear of losing face before the West, of allowing Churchill and Eisenhower to claim the political prize of Berlin. Stalin's paranoia infused every decision, cascading down through Zhukov's staff, who knew their marshal's reputation, and perhaps his very future depended on smashing German resistance quickly. The German army, bloodied and beaten, was still exacting a heavy price, and Stalin's pressure made Zhukov less forgiving and more reckless. Each hour of delay fueled Stalin's suspicion that perhaps Konev might do better. Konev, for his part, saw opportunity in Zhukov's difficulties. His First Ukrainian Front had been tasked with crushing Army Group Center in Silesia, but his gaze drifted constantly northward toward Berlin. When reports of Zhukov's stalled progress at Seelow reached Konev's headquarters, he sensed the moment to prove his superiority. With icy precision, He presented Stalin with bold plans, claiming he could turn his forces northwest and race for the capital. Stalin, ever the puppeteer, encouraged the notion, hinting but never committing, feeding Konev's ambition. To the soldiers of the First Ukrainian Front, the message was clear: Berlin might be theirs if they could move fast enough. Armored spearheads began tearing through German defenses with ferocity, pushing westward with relentless momentum. Konev's relationship with Stalin had always been tinged with rivalry and suspicion, yet in this critical hour Stalin used him as a counterweight to Zhukov's pride. The effect was electric. Two massive Soviet armies now competed not only against the Germans, but against each other for the right to plant their flag in Hitler's capital. Stalin had transformed the battlefield into an arena of rivalry, where military glory was the prize, and failure was not an option. The rivalry between Zhukov and Konev was not new. It had simmered for years through campaigns that stretched from the banks of the Volga to the plains of Ukraine. Both were ruthless in pursuit of victory, and both enjoyed Stalin's favor at different times, though never equally. Zhukov, brusque and uncompromising, often clashed with Stalin in private, yet Stalin valued his iron will and battlefield genius. Konev, more calculating and politically astute, knew how to flatter Stalin while still maintaining his own independence. The dictator thrived on their competition, never allowing one man to dominate his trust fully. In the Berlin offensive, this long-standing rivalry reached its climax, for the final victory in Europe was at stake. For the Red Army soldier in the trenches, this contest was invisible, but it shaped every order they received and every risky maneuver they were asked to perform. The lives of thousands would be gambled not only against German defenses, but also in the contest of reputations. Behind the smoke and mud of Seelow, two egos collided with a ferocity as great as any artillery barrage. Stalin had set the stage, and now he watched the drama unfold. The political dimension of the rivalry cannot be overstated. Stalin was obsessed with ensuring that the Soviet Union, not the Allies, would claim the symbolic victory of capturing Berlin. Every day the Wehrmacht held out was another day for the Western Allies to move deeper into Germany. Stalin pushed Zhukov with telegrams, personal calls, and veiled threats, reminding him of the importance of speed. Yet he also whispered encouragement to Konev, fostering the illusion that the Ukrainian front might take the prize instead. This manipulation kept both commanders on edge, driving them to hurl their forces forward with reckless abandon. Soviet logistics, already strained, bent under the pressure of accelerated timetables and constant offensives. To the men on the ground, orders seemed relentless, the pace unceasing, as if the enemy was not only Germany, but also time itself. Stalin's political game fused with military necessity, creating a campaign of unparalleled intensity. The push toward Berlin was no longer just an operation, it was a race, one driven by Stalin's iron will and the ambitions of his two greatest generals. The soldiers themselves bore the consequences of this high-level rivalry. Zhukov's men, struggling to break through the Seelow Heights, were ordered to attack again and again, regardless of losses. Exhausted infantry, battalions and tank brigades found themselves thrown into brutal assaults because their marshal could not afford the appearance of hesitation. Konev's troops, driving northward, were pushed to their limits as well, forced to cover impossible distances at lightning speed. Entire formations marched through the night, often without food or rest, just to maintain momentum and keep ahead of Zhukov's timetable. In both armies, whispers spread among the ranks that they were pawns in a contest of egos. Yet Soviet discipline allowed little room for dissent, and soldiers pressed on, fueled by hatred of the enemy and the promise of imminent victory. For many, the rivalry above was invisible, but the crushing pace of battle made its effects felt in every mud-soaked trench and burning village. The blood spilled on the Oder and beyond was the true currency of Stalin's manipulation. The prize was Berlin, but the cost was measured in tens of thousands of lives. At Stalin's headquarters, the dictator monitored every report with cold calculation, playing Zhukov and Konev against each other. His obsession with control meant that even the smallest details of their offensives were scrutinized and compared. When Zhukov faltered at Seelow, Stalin deliberately withheld encouragement, letting his anxiety grow. When Konev surged forward, Stalin sent praise, though never enough to make him complacent. Both marshals understood the rules of this dangerous game. Stalin gave nothing freely, and everything could be taken away in a heartbeat. Yet neither dared slow down, for they knew hesitation meant disgrace, and disgrace under Stalin often meant exile or worse. Thus the rivalry was not only about glory, but also about survival within Stalin's merciless system. The dictator's paranoia and hunger for dominance had transformed a military campaign into a contest of wills under his watchful eye. To Stalin this rivalry was perfect, for it ensured the destruction of Germany would come swiftly, and his generals would bleed each other dry in the process. Behind the victories, the shadow of fear loomed larger than any German gun. By mid-April, as Soviet guns thundered across the Oder and German defences buckled, the rivalry had reached its climax. Zhukov, battered but relentless, pressed his men through the Seelow Heights with brutal determination, unwilling to cede the path to Berlin. Konev, tearing through southern Germany, angled his spearheads northward, hoping to intercept the capital before Zhukov could recover. Stalin fueled the competition with cryptic messages, hinting that whoever reached Berlin first would claim the ultimate honor. For the men in Moscow this was theater, for the soldiers at the front it was life and death. The contest spurred astonishing feats of endurance, courage, and sacrifice, as entire divisions clawed their way forward in the name of victory. Berlin loomed ahead like a dark prize, its ruins waiting to become the stage for the final act of the war in Europe. The rivalry had not only shaped tactics, but also the tempo, fury, and sheer savagery of the offensive. In the end, Stalin's manipulation had worked. The Red Army surged with unstoppable momentum. The road to Berlin was open, but its pavement was laid with rivalry, ambition, and rivers of blood. Dolven. The Battle of the Seelow Heights dragged into its second and third days, transforming from a thunderous assault into a grinding war of attrition. Soviet forces, confident that sheer numbers would shatter the German line, found themselves bogged down in a nightmare of mud, craters, and relentless counterfire. Every advance across the fields demanded a blood toll, as machine guns and artillery cut down ranks of Red Army soldiers. German defenders, though depleted and under constant bombardment, clung desperately to each trench, pillbox, and farmstead. The air reeked of cordite, smoke, and the stench of rotting corpses, with battlefields littered by twisted bodies and shattered steel. Soviet commanders pushed wave after wave forward, knowing that hesitation meant giving the Germans breathing room. But the Germans, commanded by Heinrici's foresight, used terrain and timing to maximize their limited strength. Panther tanks prowled ridge slopes, emerging only long enough to fire before withdrawing into cover. Infantry squads launched small but effective counterattacks, keeping Soviet troops from consolidating their gains. The battle had devolved into a contest of willpower, with attrition grinding down both armies. Third Reich. The second day, April 17th, dawned with Soviet forces resuming their attack under a pale, smoke-filled sky. By then, the Soviet High Command expected a breakthrough, yet the Germans still held the ridgelines overlooking the Oder plain. Soviet artillery pounded the hills again, but the defenders had dug so deep that only surface positions were destroyed. Soviet infantry surged forward through mud and wire, only to be cut apart by interlocking machine gun fields. Every few meters of advance came at the cost of dozens of lives. In response, German units counterattacked with small groups, emerging from hidden bunkers to strike at vulnerable flanks. These counterattacks rarely lasted long, but they slowed the Soviet advance enough to buy critical hours. Soviet commanders grew impatient, their maps showing little territorial gain, despite enormous sacrifices. Yet Stalin's orders were clear. Seelow had to fall, no matter the cost. The day ended with thousands dead on both sides, and the ridges still defiant. April 18th brought worsening conditions as rain fell, turning the battlefield into a swamp of blood and mud. Tanks became mired in soggy ground, their tracks slipping as they tried to push uphill under fire. Soviet engineers attempted to lay logs and planks across ditches, but these makeshift paths were often destroyed by German artillery within minutes. Casualties mounted as medics struggled to reach the wounded, many of whom lay crying in the mud until silenced by another shell. Soviet soldiers, exhausted from near-constant attacks, began using corpses for cover, stacking them against embankments in grotesque shields. German defenders, equally weary, relied more heavily on snipers and anti-tank teams to conserve dwindling ammunition. The fighting blurred into a haze of endless skirmishes, raids, and desperate charges. Both armies understood that the battle was becoming one of endurance, not just firepower. Heinrici's plan had always been to bleed the Soviets as long as possible, and for now it was working. Still, the Red Army's sheer numbers ensured the Germans could not hold forever. The air war above the battlefield intensified during these days of carnage. Soviet aircraft, flying relentless sorties, strafed German positions, dropping bombs on suspected bunkers and command posts. The Luftwaffe, reduced to a shadow of its former self, scrambled only a handful of fighters, often too few to make a meaningful impact. German troops clung to whatever cover they could find as explosions rained across the heights. Yet even under air attack, the defenders managed to inflict heavy losses, with well-camouflaged flak batteries bringing down Soviet planes in bursts of black smoke. The constant roar of engines and artillery created a deafening backdrop, a ceaseless thunder that numbed the senses. Soldiers on both sides lost track of time, measuring hours not by the sun but by the intensity of bombardments. Some Soviet units advanced by crawling through shell holes, using smoke and fog as cover. Others, caught in open ground, were obliterated within minutes. The battle was no longer about maneuver, but about who could endure the storm longer. German morale, though battered, remained surprisingly firm through April 18th. Many soldiers fought not out of loyalty to Hitler, but because retreat meant annihilation and surrender often meant death. They knew Berlin lay only kilometers behind them, and each day they delayed the Soviets was another day for civilians to escape westward. The Volkssturm, once ridiculed as useless, proved unexpectedly stubborn in certain sectors, manning barricades and firing from windows with captured or outdated weapons. Old men and teenage boys stood alongside hardened veterans, their desperation fueling a grim defiance. Soviet troops who expected the Volkssturm to collapse were stunned by their willingness to fight to the death. Heinrici had inspired this resilience by carefully preparing defensive belts, ensuring that even the weakest units could hold positions for hours. Still, losses were heavy and replacements were non-existent. German companies dwindled to platoons, and platoons to scattered squads. The defenders were holding on, but at the cost of burning themselves out. On the Soviet side, frustration grew into near desperation, as progress remained painfully slow. General Zhukov, under enormous pressure from Stalin, lashed out at subordinates for their inability to break the German line. Communications crackled with frantic orders, demanding attacks to continue at all costs. Soviet artillery commanders began firing barrages without precise coordinates, saturating entire ridges in hopes of collapsing resistance. This blunt force approach destroyed villages, forests, and farms, but it did not eradicate the defenders hiding underground. Soviet infantry, many fresh recruits, suffered horrendous losses as they advanced into kill zones cleared by their own artillery. Tank crews pushed forward through smoking ruins, often without infantry support, only to be picked off by German panzerfausts at close range. The battlefield was a meat grinder, devouring lives faster than reinforcements could arrive. Yet despite these losses, the Soviet willpower never faltered. For them, victory at Seelow was not optional. It was the doorway to Berlin. By the third day, April 18th, the toll of the fighting was staggering. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers lay dead or wounded, their bodies carpeting the fields in gruesome waves. German losses were smaller in number but irreplaceable, each casualty weakening already depleted formations. The Seelow Heights, once peaceful farmland, had been transformed into a vision of hell, smouldering craters, burned-out tanks, shattered homes, and rivers running red with blood. Prisoners on both sides were rare, as mercy was a luxury neither army could afford in such brutality. The fighting had reached such intensity that commanders compared it to Verdun and Stalingrad, a modern echo of battles where sheer attrition determined the outcome. Men who survived each charge were often too shocked to speak, their eyes blank and their uniforms soaked in blood and mud. The dead lay unburied, a silent testimony to the futility of each day's carnage. Both sides sensed the battle was approaching a climax, but no one knew how much longer it would last. As night fell on the third day, both armies were exhausted beyond measure. Soviet troops huddled in shallow trenches, clutching rifles and waiting for orders to attack again. German defenders shivered in their bunkers, rationing food and ammunition, aware that resupply was nearly impossible. Fires from burning villages cast an eerie glow across the horizon, lighting up the smoke that lingered over the battlefield. The cries of the wounded echoed through the darkness, mingling with the distant rumble of tanks repositioning for the next push. For Heinrici's men, survival depended on another day of stubborn resistance. For Zhukov's armies, victory was demanded at any price, even if it meant annihilation. The Seelow Heights had become a crucible, grinding both attacker and defender down to their breaking points. After 3 days of unrelenting carnage, the outcome was still uncertain. Yet every soldier knew that the struggle was entering its decisive stage. The war of attrition could not last much longer, and the fate of Berlin hung in the balance. On the morning of April 18th, 1945, the thunder of war still echoed across the ridges of the Seelow Heights, but something fundamental had shifted. The Soviet armies, after 3 days of grinding against stone-like defenses, began to feel the cracks widening in the German line. Heinrici's carefully orchestrated withdrawal tactics, which had held the Red Army at bay, were finally faltering under sheer weight of numbers and firepower. Soviet commanders sensed the weakening pulse of German resistance, reading each moment as an opening to press harder. The fields below the ridges, once impassable, now swarmed with Soviet infantry advancing in tight formations, their silhouettes breaking through the haze of gun smoke. Tanks churned through the sodden earth, creating makeshift tracks where artillery had flattened obstacles. The German defensive belts, once seamless, now showed dangerous gaps where reserves had been consumed. Supply lines to German strongpoints were cut or under constant artillery harassment, starving defenders of ammunition. Exhausted Volkssturm fighters and Hitler Youth units, who had stood in ditches with panzerfasts, now faced wave after wave without reprieve. The balance was tilting, and the Seelow Heights were on the verge of collapse. For the Germans, the breaking point came not from a single catastrophic event, but from countless small fractures accumulating over days of relentless assault. Heinrici's strategy of elastic defense had delayed the Soviets, but had also drained his limited resources at a catastrophic rate. Panzer divisions that once acted as fire brigades, rushing from one hot sector to another, now had dwindled to a handful of serviceable tanks. The 88 guns that had raked Soviet armor with deadly precision were running low on shells, some abandoned when their crews were killed. Communications between command posts were severed by artillery barrages, leaving entire companies isolated and leaderless. Ammunition wagons struggled to reach frontline units through mud, minefields, and constant shellfire. Field hospitals overflowed, with medics forced to treat grievous wounds in barns and cellars while artillery shook the walls. German morale, though hardened by desperation, began to buckle under the realization that reinforcements would never arrive. Heinrici had prepared for a battle of days, but Stalin had committed armies that could fight for weeks without pause. By April 18th, attrition itself had become the Soviets' greatest weapon. The Soviet push forward was marked by brutal determination and extraordinary coordination between artillery, armor, and infantry. Entire regiments of Katyusha rocket launchers opened fire in devastating unison, their shrieking trails cutting across the sky before crashing into German lines. Infantrymen advanced close behind the barrage, exploiting the shock and disorientation of defenders before they could regroup. T-34 cells rolled forward in columns, their guns firing continuously, smashing bunkers and machine gun nests that had once resisted countless attacks. Engineers worked tirelessly to clear mines under fire, detonating paths that allowed Soviet armor to surge through fields once thought impenetrable. The marshes that had drowned Soviet attempts days before now became killing zones for retreating Germans caught in open ground. Cavalry detachments, rarely seen this late in the war, were even deployed to chase down stragglers trying to flee across the Oder's floodplains. Soviet commanders had learned from the early costly mistakes and now advanced with brutal efficiency, closing every gap, hammering every pocket. German counterattacks grew weaker and more desperate, often ending before they could even reach enemy lines. Entire villages that had served as bastions of defense were systematically reduced to rubble. The tide had become unstoppable. Inside Berlin, word of the weakening front filtered back to Hitler's bunker, where disbelief gave way to fury. Hitler raged against his generals, demanding impossible counteroffensives and condemning Heinrici for his caution. But even the most loyal officers knew the truth. The Oder line was collapsing, and the Red Army was preparing to surge toward the capital. In contrast, Soviet headquarters buzzed with anticipation as Stalin pressed Zhukov and Konev to deliver the final breakthrough. Political stakes were now intertwined with military maneuvers, with both commanders desperate to be the one who claimed Berlin. Radio messages crackled with urgency as front commanders reported that the German resistance was faltering in sectors once considered untouchable. Zhukov, stung by early setbacks, urged his men onward with renewed ferocity, determined to redeem his name before Stalin. Soldiers were told they were fighting not just for victory, but for history itself, to raise the hammer and sickle over the Reichstag. For the ordinary Red Army soldier, the Seelow Heights were no longer an obstacle, but a gateway to Berlin, and with each passing hour, the city lay closer within reach. The fighting on April 18th reached a crescendo as Soviet divisions concentrated on the final ridges guarding the road to Berlin. Panther tanks hidden in groves of trees fought until they were destroyed, their blackened hulks littering the fields like monuments of defiance. German artillery pieces, dragged to new positions, fired until their barrels overheated, then were abandoned in haste. Soviet infantry stormed hilltop trenches, often finding defenders too exhausted to resist, their rifles empty and hands trembling. The bodies of both attackers and defenders carpeted the slopes, testimony to the unrelenting ferocity of the struggle. Every meter gained was paid for in blood, but the Soviet commanders never relented, pouring fresh battalions into the fight. The Germans, once masters of the defensive art, now fought as fragmented units clinging to survival. For every position that fell, a handful of defenders fled deeper west, seeking to regroup, but often overtaken by advancing Soviet tanks. Smoke and fire turned the landscape into an infernal panorama, blotting out the sun with columns of black ash. By nightfall, the last line of resistance on the Seelow Heights was shattering. The psychological strain on German defenders was immense, and it showed in every trench and ruined farmhouse. Soldiers who had fought through Normandy, the Ardennes, and the Eastern Front's endless retreats recognized the end when they saw it. They whispered of the advancing Soviets with fear, not just for military defeat but for vengeance that awaited them. Rumors of atrocities committed in East Prussia circulated among the ranks, draining what little will to fight remained. Officers exhorted their men to stand firm, but even their words carried an undertone of despair. The Volkssturm, poorly armed and poorly trained, often deserted at night, slipping away through forests before Soviet patrols closed in. Hitler youth fighters, indoctrinated with fanatic zeal, fought with suicidal bravery, but rarely lived long enough to influence the battle. Heinrici himself, a soldier of discipline and professionalism, could do nothing more than manage a retreat under fire. His carefully measured plans had slowed the Soviets, but could not hold them forever. The dam had burst, and the flood was rushing toward Berlin. For the Soviets, April 18th was a day of vindication, but it was also a day of enormous sacrifice. Casualty lists mounted as regiments were ground down in the effort to break through, even as victory came within sight. Medics carried the wounded back through mud-choked paths, while shells continued to fall around them. Tank crews spoke of fighting in endless duels, trading shots with Panthers and Stugs at ranges so close that escape was impossible. Infantrymen described advancing over fields littered with the dead, stepping past comrades and enemies alike as they pressed forward. Yet the momentum carried them onward, for to falter now was to waste the lives already given. Commanders reminded their troops that Berlin was just days away, and that their sacrifices would be remembered forever. The thunder of artillery behind them gave each soldier a sense of inevitability, as though history itself was propelling them forward. The blood-soaked ridges of Seelow would be remembered as the gateway through which the Red Army stormed toward final victory. By the night of April 18th, the German line had been irreparably breached. As darkness fell, the Seelow Heights stood as a graveyard of armies, the last echo of Heinrici's great defense, swallowed by Soviet triumph. Fires burned across the landscape, casting an eerie glow that flickered over ruined villages and shattered ridgelines. Soviet soldiers dug in on newly captured high ground, staring westward toward the distant glow of Berlin. The capital now lay just 50 miles away, a prize within reach after 4 years of brutal struggle. German survivors limped westward, retreating in scattered bands, their cohesion destroyed, their mission reduced to survival. Heinrici ordered withdrawals to new fallback positions, but even he knew these were delaying actions, not salvation. In Moscow, Stalin was informed of the breakthrough, his anticipation sharpening as the final act of the war approached. For Zhukov, the breach was not only a military success, but also a personal redemption, proof that his army could deliver under immense pressure. For the Germans, it marked the beginning of the final retreat, a journey that would end inside the burning ruins of their capital. April 18th was the day the gates to Berlin swung open, and there would be no closing them again. As April 18th bled into April 19th, the German front along the Seelow Heights collapsed under the relentless Soviet pressure. Defensive trenches once considered impenetrable lay abandoned, littered with broken rifles, shattered helmets, and the lifeless bodies of men who had fought until the end. Entire companies of the German Ninth Army dissolved into fragmented groups, retreating westward through forests and marshes, hoping to avoid encirclement. Panic spread quickly as communication lines were severed, leaving officers blind and soldiers leaderless. Orders to hold were ignored, replaced by the instinct to survive. The retreat was not organized but chaotic, a disjointed flight under fire. Columns of men collided in the night, artillery shells bursting overhead, scattering the exhausted remnants of battalions. German medical stations were overrun, leaving the wounded to fend for themselves or fall into Soviet hands. The once proud defense of the Oder line now devolved into a desperate scramble toward Berlin. It was the unraveling of Germany's last stand on the frontier, a turning point that opened the gates to the Reich's capital. The roads leading west became clogged with retreating soldiers, battered vehicles, and terrified civilians caught in the maelstrom. Horse-drawn wagons carrying meager possessions mingled with Panther tanks retreating under smoke, while Volkssturm boys trudged alongside veterans of Stalingrad, their faces equally hollowed by exhaustion. Horses collapsed from overwork, their bodies abandoned on the roadside as survivors pushed forward without pause. Refugees carried children on their backs, their eyes wide with terror as artillery fire drew nearer with every hour. Some clutched faded photographs or family heirlooms, unwilling to abandon the last remnants of their lives before the war. The chaos blurred the line between military and civilian movement, as soldiers discarded uniforms to blend with fleeing townsfolk. Soviet aircraft prowled overhead, swooping down to strafe columns of retreat, leaving mangled wrecks burning on the roads. Bridges crumbled under the weight of the retreat, either blown by German engineers to slow the Soviets, or collapsing from overuse. In this tide of humanity, order disintegrated, and discipline gave way to fear. The once disciplined Wehrmacht was now little more than a river of fugitives. General Gotthard Heinrici, the commander of Army Group Vistula, had anticipated the collapse, but watched helplessly as his warnings to Hitler had been ignored. Heinrici had argued that the defensive line was stretched too thin, its resources exhausted, and its troops demoralized beyond repair. Now his predictions were realized in the worst possible way, with entire divisions reduced to shadows of their former strength. He attempted to orchestrate an orderly withdrawal, but the chaos on the ground made coordination impossible. Staff officers sent dispatch riders who never returned, swallowed up in the retreating mass. Radio commands were drowned in static, or contradicted by Hitler's furious orders to hold positions to the last man. Heinrici knew such commands were detached from reality, but defiance meant death, and he struggled to preserve what remained of his forces. The retreat became a paradox. It was both necessary for survival, and yet condemned by Berlin as cowardice. For Heinrici, it was a grim calculation of saving lives versus obeying an already doomed Führer. The battlefield now reflected that tragic contradiction in every retreating column. Noffer test war. Meanwhile, the Soviets pressed forward with unrelenting ferocity, their vanguard storming through abandoned German strongpoints with ease. Soviet tanks rolled across the blood-soaked ridgelines, crushing barbed wire beneath their treads, as Red Army soldiers raised their banners over captured bunkers. Loudspeakers blared messages promising mercy to surrendering Germans, though few trusted the words after years of brutal combat on the Eastern Front. Artillery fire raked the retreating columns, tearing gaps into already broken formations. Soviet cavalry units pursued stragglers through woods and fields, cutting down the weak and capturing the terrified. Prisoners of war marched eastward under guard, their hands raised, while their comrades continued the retreat in hopeless defiance. Stalin had demanded that Berlin be taken quickly, and Zhukov and Konev drove their armies mercilessly toward that goal. The fleeing Germans, battered and exhausted, could not hope to match the momentum of the Red Army. The great battle for the Oder had now shifted fully into a chase, one side fighting to survive, the other to deliver the final blow. The Führerbunker. Within the German ranks, discipline fractured further as cohesion broke down under pressure. Soldiers abandoned heavy weapons, discarding machine guns and mortars in ditches to hasten their escape. Some units turned on each other in desperation, accusing fellow formations of retreating too soon or failing to hold their flanks. Rumors spread wildly of Soviet tanks already encircling Berlin, of SS units executing retreating soldiers, of Hitler preparing to unleash secret weapons. These whispers fueled paranoia, making every man's steps heavier with dread. Stragglers formed small bands, navigating through forests to avoid Soviet columns, but many were cut off and surrounded. Officers who attempted to rally their men were sometimes ignored, sometimes shot, and occasionally abandoned altogether. Drunkenness and looting grew rampant as soldiers ransacked farms and villages in search of food and liquor. The German army that had once prided itself on iron discipline was now disintegrating before the eyes of its survivors. What remained was no longer an organized fighting force, but a scattered, frightened multitude stumbling toward inevitable defeat. For civilians trapped in the chaos, the retreat was a nightmare unfolding in real time. Entire towns were abandoned overnight, their inhabitants fleeing before the Soviet advance, leaving behind empty houses and smoldering ruins. Women and children walked barefoot for miles, their belongings carried in sacks or carts, struggling to keep pace with the soldiers. Some sought refuge in churches, only to find the buildings shelled by artillery or overrun by combat. The constant roar of battle never ceased, day or night, as explosions lit the sky and machine gun bursts echoed across the plains. Rumors of Soviet retribution spread like wildfire, filling the air with dread. Mothers wept silently as they tried to shield their children from what awaited them, while the elderly collapsed on the roadside, unable to continue. The human suffering became an ocean of despair, merging with the retreating soldiers into one indistinguishable mass of tragedy. In every direction, smoke from burning villages blotted the horizon, marking the relentless path of the advancing Red Army. This was not just a military retreat, but the complete unraveling of a society under siege. As German units withdrew, they left behind a landscape of devastation, fields cratered by shells, forests stripped bare by artillery, and rivers choked with debris. Bridges that had once connected towns now lay in ruins, twisted steel and splintered wood jutting from the water. Abandoned German vehicles, from tanks to bicycles, littered the roads, many destroyed to prevent capture. Supply depots were set aflame by retreating troops, sending plumes of black smoke into the sky. Ammunition dumps exploded in thunderous blasts, shaking the ground and leaving behind only charred craters. The retreat was both destructive and self-consuming, as the Germans sought to deny the Soviets every scrap of material. Yet in their haste they often destroyed resources their own men desperately needed: food, fuel, and shelter. The landscape itself seemed to testify to the futility of the German effort. What was once fortified ground had been transformed into a wasteland, a testament to a retreat that carried with it the collapse of the Reich itself. By April 20th, the retreat had reached a fever pitch, with Soviet forces closing the distance to Berlin itself. The Ninth Army, once the shield of the capital, was now a broken fragment limping toward the city. Soldiers who staggered into Berlin brought with them tales of horror and defeat, spreading panic among the defenders inside the city. Hitler's birthday was marked not by triumph, but by the sound of Soviet artillery echoing across the suburbs of the Reich's capital. For the men still retreating, there was little left but exhaustion, hunger, and despair. Many no longer believed in victory, fighting only to avoid Soviet captivity or execution by their own officers. The retreat into Berlin was not a march of armies, but a funeral procession of a dying nation. As the Red Army prepared to encircle the capital, the last fragments of German resistance melted into the ruins of their once mighty Reichs. The war in Europe was now entering its final and most desperate act, with the road to Berlin paved in retreat, ruin, and the ashes of a collapsing empire. Battle. With the Seelow Heights finally behind them, the Soviet armies surged westward, their armored columns stretching as far as the eye could see across the flattened German countryside. The rumble of thousands of tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces shook the very earth, turning roads into rivers of steel. Dust clouds billowed upward, obscuring the sky, while the faint spring sun glinted off endless rows of Red Star insignia painted on turrets and helmets. Soldiers rode atop tanks, gripping their rifles tightly, their faces marked by exhaustion, yet burning with determination. Horses pulling artillery wagons plodded alongside roaring engines, a striking contrast of modern and old-world warfighting. Loudspeakers on command vehicles blared martial music, mingling with the constant roar of engines and the clattering of steel tracks. Soviet engineers worked frantically to repair bridges and clear roadblocks, ensuring the advancing divisions never slowed. Abandoned German positions, still smoking from the previous battles, lined the roadsides, silent testimony to the carnage left behind. Every passing mile seemed to bring the soldiers closer to the looming heart of Hitler's empire. The road to Berlin had finally opened, and the Red Army intended to storm it with unstoppable momentum. The speed of the advance was breathtaking, yet it came at the cost of strain and chaos within Soviet logistics. Ammunition trucks, fuel convoys, and food supplies stretched far behind the front, struggling to keep pace with the racing spearheads. Mechanics worked night and day to patch up battle-damaged tanks, sometimes welding under fire just to keep the machines running. Field kitchens distributed thin soups and black bread in a hurried fashion, soldiers eating as they marched, or while clinging to the sides of advancing vehicles. Medical stations sprang up on the roadside, treating endless streams of wounded men ferried back from the front lines. Horses that could no longer pull their loads collapsed in the mud, their carcasses left behind for scavenging crows. Every bridge destroyed by retreating Germans became a choke point, forcing Soviet sappers to erect makeshift crossings under constant pressure. Yet, despite the obstacles, Zhukov's armies pressed forward, driven by both discipline and sheer momentum. Orders rang out with urgency, urging commanders to waste no time in consolidating gains. Stalin demanded speed, and every soldier understood that the gates of Berlin must be reached before the Germans could regroup. On the German side, the retreat had degenerated into chaos, and the advancing Soviets often passed scenes of disorder that told of a collapsing army. Columns of refugees clogged the same roads that Wehrmacht units desperately tried to use for withdrawal, creating bottlenecks that stretched for miles. Civilians pushed carts piled high with meager possessions, their faces pale with fear, as Soviet tanks ground past them without slowing. Shattered German units abandoned heavy weapons, blowing up their own vehicles to prevent capture, leaving twisted hulks smouldering in the ditches. Disorganized Volkssturm fighters, some barely in uniform, tried to hold crossroads with rifles from another war, only to be swept aside in minutes. Horses panicked at the thunder of artillery, overturning carts as frightened families scrambled into fields. German officers struggled to impose order, their shouted commands drowned out by the roar of engines and the pounding of artillery from the east. The retreat no longer looked like a tactical withdrawal. It resembled a flood being chased by a hurricane. Even veteran Wehrmacht troops, hardened by years of fighting, found themselves swept up in the panic. To the Soviets, it seemed as though the German army itself was crumbling before their eyes. Despite the appearance of collapse, pockets of German resistance remained fierce and determined, slowing the Soviet advance at crucial choke points. Panther tanks, dug into hidden positions along tree lines, ambushed Soviet columns with deadly precision, knocking out leading vehicles before slipping back into cover. 88 guns, hastily repositioned on hillsides, rained shells onto bridges and supply routes, forcing delays in movement. Small towns became fortresses, their stone buildings bristling with machine guns, where fanatical SS units swore to fight to the last man. Soviet infantry were often forced to dismount and clear these strongholds, house by house, turning each hamlet into a miniature battlefield. Mines laid in fields and roads claimed countless lives, shredding trucks and scattering advancing formations. German artillery, though fewer in number, struck with alarming accuracy, guided by observers who knew every contour of their homeland. The Soviets had the numbers, but the Germans had the terrain, and every delay cost time that Stalin demanded they did not waste. Commanders grew impatient, urging their men forward even as casualties mounted. Yet nothing could mask the reality. The German defense was bending, and once broken there would be no recovery. For Soviet soldiers, the drive toward Berlin carried with it a sense of destiny unlike any other battle they had fought. Many had marched thousands of miles from the steppes of Russia, through the ruins of Stalingrad, across Poland, and now stood at the threshold of their enemy's capital. Songs were sung on the march, their lyrics about vengeance and triumph echoing over the columns of men and machines. For others, the faces of fallen comrades haunted their thoughts, and Berlin became not just a city, but the symbol of final justice. Letters written home spoke of pride and anticipation, some soldiers promising their families that they would soon strike the heart of fascism. Propaganda leaflets distributed among the troops reminded them of German atrocities, inflaming their determination with memories of suffering villages and massacred civilians. The red banner was carried forward in every division, fluttering proudly above the dust and smoke. The thought of planting that flag over Berlin's Reichstag became an obsession, whispered in conversations and shouted in drunken toasts at night. Yet beneath the pride lay exhaustion, and many wondered if their bodies could endure one last great push. Still, no one dared slow down, for the tide of history was carrying them forward. Zhukov himself, orchestrating the advance, faced the constant strain of command under Stalin's watchful eye. Reports streamed into his headquarters at all hours, detailing progress, losses, and logistical bottlenecks that threatened momentum. Radios crackled with frantic messages as officers begged for reinforcements or air support to overcome stubborn German defenses. Stalin's constant pressure weighed heavily, demanding both speed and total destruction of the German forces, with no excuses tolerated. The rivalry with Konev to the south pushed Zhukov's urgency even further, each commander desperate to claim the prize of Berlin for himself. Maps on Zhukov's table became crowded with pins marking captured towns, blown bridges, and still active German strongholds. His temper often flared, berating subordinates for hesitation or failure to push harder. Yet even his iron will could not completely eliminate the confusion and exhaustion that rippled through the ranks. Still, every passing day brought him closer to Berlin, and the knowledge of victory ahead outweighed the heavy toll. To Zhukov, hesitation meant dishonor, and dishonor was unacceptable with the world watching. As the columns surged forward, the landscape itself became a witness to the unstoppable momentum of the Red Army. Fields once green with spring growth were reduced to churned mud, blackened by fires and scarred with craters from artillery. Entire villages were left smoldering ruins, their walls collapsed into heaps of stone and ash, smoke still curling into the sky. Roads were littered with abandoned vehicles, German trucks, overturned carts, and even Soviet tanks, too damaged to continue the march. Bridges groaned under the weight of armor, some collapsing into rivers, swallowing entire convoys in an instant. Forests burned at the edges, casting eerie orange glows over the horizon, while the smell of cordite and scorched earth clung to the air. Birds scattered from treetops as waves of artillery fire rolled westward in constant thunder. Streams ran dark with oil and blood, carrying the detritus of battle further downstream. Soldiers who had once dreamed of home now spoke only of Berlin, as though it were the sole destination in existence. Every step forward was soaked in destruction, yet every mile brought them closer to the end. By April 20th, the Soviets had crossed the Oder's last tributaries and were pressing directly against Berlin's outer defences. Their advance now unstoppable. The city's skyline loomed in the distance, a jagged outline of church spires and industrial smokestacks against the grey spring sky. Officers told their men they were marching into history, that every shot fired would echo in generations to come. The air grew thick with anticipation, as artillery units positioned themselves for the bombardment that would soon rain fire on Hitler's capital. German forces, though broken, prepared to defend their capital with fanaticism, turning Berlin into a fortress of rubble. Soviet soldiers tightened their grips on rifles, knowing the final struggle would eclipse even the horrors of Seelow Heights. Journalists embedded with the Red Army wrote dispatches in hurried scribbles, struggling to capture the magnitude of what was about to unfold. To the east, reinforcements were still pouring in, fresh divisions eager to claim their share of glory in Berlin. For the men at the front, however, there was no pause, no reflection, only the relentless drive forward. The road to Berlin had been carved in blood, fire, and sacrifice, and nothing short of total victory would stop it. As the German front lines collapsed in April 1945, the war spilled into the villages, towns, and open roads of East Germany, engulfing civilians in its final fury. Entire communities packed what little they could carry into handcarts, wagons, and bicycles, fleeing westward with desperate hope. Refugees stretched in endless columns across muddy roads, trampled fields, and frozen riverbanks. Mothers dragged children by the hand while elderly men and women stumbled under bundles of blankets and food. Livestock mixed with the human tide, cattle and goats, driven alongside carts creaking under the weight of belongings. The roar of artillery thundered behind them, a constant reminder that the Red Army was never far away. Fear of the advancing Soviets drove this exodus, fueled by stories of atrocities that spread like wildfire from one village to the next. Families clutched together, praying they could reach American or British lines before the red tide overtook them. What had once been ordinary country roads were now highways of despair, thick with humanity in motion. It was a migration without order, a sea of suffering pushing westward against time itself. The collapse of German defences left civilians exposed, often without warning or protection, as frontline chaos shifted suddenly. Villages that had been promised safety one day were engulfed in flames, the next abandoned by retreating Wehrmacht units. Fields turned into battlefields overnight, littered with corpses and shattered homes. In towns like Frankfurt and Oder and Kustrin, terrified civilians poured into the streets, their fear amplified by the knowledge that their army was no longer capable of holding back the Soviet advance. Rail stations overflowed with desperate refugees, trying to secure space on overcrowded trains. Families were often separated in the crush, with children and parents torn apart in the chaos of departure. Train cars meant for 50 were packed with hundreds, suffocating in the press of bodies. For many there was no train, no wagon, only the long march through mud, hunger, and exhaustion. The roads became graveyards for the weak, with countless elderly and infants collapsing along the way. German civilians had entered the war as bystanders, now they were its final victims. Behind this tide of humanity lay fear of vengeance, a fear cultivated by years of Nazi propaganda and now made real by the war's brutal spiral. The Red Army's reputation preceded it. Tales of looting, destruction, and mass sexual violence spread ahead of its advance. Women whispered in hushed tones about what might happen if the Soviets caught them, some resorting to desperate measures to protect themselves. In many families, fathers and brothers who had survived the fighting were too weak or wounded to shield them. Suicide pacts emerged in towns where fear overcame hope, with families choosing death together rather than capture. Wells and rivers became grim refuges for those who leapt in to escape fate. Local clergy tried to calm the panic, urging civilians to endure, but few words could soften the terror that had taken hold. For the Soviets, the suffering of civilians was often dismissed as the deserved consequence of German aggression. The sins of the Reich were being answered on the soil of Germany itself, and yet within this vast suffering, each family experienced it as an individual tragedy, immediate and personal. Visas. The refugee columns moved at a snail's pace, often overtaken by Soviet tanks and armored vehicles that cut through the masses without pause. Soldiers shouted for civilians to scatter, sometimes firing warning shots into the air, leaving terrified families scrambling into ditches. Horses collapsed from exhaustion, wagons overturned, and belongings were abandoned in the rush to escape. A child's doll, a torn diary, a soldier's uniform worn by a widowed wife, all were left behind in the mud as the march continued. Food was scarce, with most families surviving on crusts of bread or whatever they could scavenge along the way. Hunger hollowed faces and weakened limbs, slowing the pace of escape. For many children, hunger turned to sickness, their cries blending into the groans of the march. Those who could no longer move were often left by the roadside, as families had no strength to carry them further. Each passing day thinned the column, as despair consumed the weakest. The journey westward became not just a flight from the Soviets, but a march toward death for many. The Wehrmacht retreat added to the chaos, with soldiers withdrawing in disorder through the same roads as civilians. Columns of exhausted troops, many wounded and malnourished, mixed with refugees, creating confusion and desperation. Some soldiers tried to maintain discipline, guiding civilians out of danger zones, but most were focused only on their own survival. Military vehicles plowed through crowds, their commanders unwilling to slow the retreat for civilians. The Volkssturm, made up of old men and young boys, often abandoned posts to flee with their families. Every retreating German unit carried with it the stench of defeat, their weapons and uniforms no longer symbols of strength but of collapse. Abandoned tanks, broken artillery pieces, and piles of discarded rifles littered the roadside. The line between soldier and refugee blurred, with entire divisions reduced to ragged mobs marching west. Yet civilians still looked to these remnants of the army with faint hope, clinging to the idea that protection might still be possible. But in truth, the German army was now a mirror of its people, broken, scattered, and in flight. In cities further west, chaos reigned as the flood of refugees overwhelmed resources. Town squares filled with wagons and carts, while public buildings became makeshift shelters for hundreds crammed inside. Food rationing collapsed under the strain, with bakeries and markets emptied within hours of arrival. Hospitals overflowed with both military wounded and civilian casualties from air raids and exhaustion. Disease began to spread in these crowded conditions, typhus and dysentery taking lives by the dozens. Black markets thrived, with cigarettes, bread and boots traded at impossible prices. Local authorities, stripped of power and resources, struggled to maintain order. Air raid sirens added new terror, as Allied bombers still struck German towns, even as their people fled from the east. The sense of collapse was complete. There was no sanctuary, no safe zone left in Germany. For civilians, it felt as if the entire nation was crumbling beneath their feet. Among the refugees, the psychological burden was crushing. The Reich that had promised glory and dominion now abandoned its people to chaos and retribution. Many asked themselves how it had come to this, how the war that once seemed so distant now consumed their very homes. The propaganda of victory still blared on radios, but no one believed it anymore. Rumors carried more weight than official broadcasts, as word of advancing Soviets and collapsing defenses spread faster than the truth. Children asked questions their parents could not answer, their innocence shattered by the march westward. Old men muttered bitterly about leaders who had betrayed them, yet still feared to speak too loudly. Women carried not only their belongings, but also the crushing dread of what awaited them should they fall behind. Families who once believed themselves part of a proud nation now trudged like exiles in their own land. It was despair, pure and unrelenting, that defined these final days. The refugee crisis in East Germany during the final weeks of the war became one of history's great tragedies, a testament to the cost of total war. While soldiers clashed at Seelow Heights, and on the Oder, the civilian front dissolved into ruin. For every mile the Soviets advanced, thousands of civilians were displaced, their lives uprooted in an instant, villages emptied, churches abandoned, and schools left silent as entire populations took to the roads. In the eyes of the fleeing, the future held no certainty, only fear and exhaustion. For those who reached the west, there was a faint chance of survival under Allied occupation. For those who did not, their lives became part of the reckoning unleashed upon Germany by its own war of aggression. The war had come full circle, punishing not just armies, but the people themselves. The collapse of East Germany was not only a military defeat, it was the unraveling of a society. And in this unraveling, the human cost became undeniable, visible on every road, in every wagon, in every desperate face turned westward. The battle for the Seelow Heights left behind a landscape scarred by unimaginable destruction, a vast graveyard of men, machines, and villages erased from the map. Soviet formations, advancing under the weight of Stalin's urgency, had sustained losses measured not in hundreds, but in tens of thousands, their bodies littering the fields and river crossings. Entire rifle divisions, thrown against entrenched German defences, were reduced to half their strength within a single day of combat. The muddy plains were transformed into killing fields where artillery shells turned flesh into unrecognizable fragments and craters filled with blood and rainwater. German defenders, though vastly outnumbered, had suffered in equal measure, their units annihilated under relentless barrages and waves of Soviet infantry. For many, survival was no longer measured in victories, but in whether they would live through another hour of ceaseless battle. Villages that had stood for centuries were obliterated in minutes, their churches collapsing under tank fire, and their homes reduced to smouldering ruins. The cries of civilians trapped in cellars mingled with the thunder of war, a chorus of despair rising above the smoke. The Seelow Heights had become more than a battlefield. It was a monument to human endurance and human suffering. Every hill, ditch, and farmstead became a silent witness to the staggering price of war. The Soviet army paid for every meter of ground in blood, a grim equation that reflected Stalin's insistence on pressing forward regardless of the cost. Riflemen, often armed with little more than rifles and bayonets, advanced across open fields swept by machine gun fire, their comrades falling in droves before they even reached the first line of trenches. Casualty reports mounted so quickly that headquarters lost track, the numbers becoming abstract figures detached from the broken bodies they represented. Soviet medics, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the wounded, turned barns and farmhouses into makeshift hospitals, where soldiers screamed through amputations performed without anesthesia. The stench of blood, sweat, and decay hung over these field stations, as hundreds lay waiting for help that never came. German prisoners of war, captured amid the carnage, often stared in shock at the sheer number of Soviet dead, realizing that the Red Army's strength came from a willingness to endure endless sacrifice. For every fallen Soviet, another was ready to take his place, a relentless tide that no amount of German firepower could fully stop. Yet behind this determination lay personal tragedies, letters left unfinished, photographs of families clutched in lifeless hands, dreams extinguished before they ever reached Berlin. The ground was soaked with the human cost, and every step forward carried the weight of thousands of lives. German casualties were equally catastrophic, though borne by smaller, concentrated units, who fought until they were annihilated. Heinrici's army had been stretched thin, with divisions often reduced to mere battalions clinging to defensive positions under impossible odds. Panther tanks, once symbols of German engineering supremacy, were abandoned smouldering along country roads, their crews either incinerated inside or cut down as they tried to escape. The vaunted 88 mm guns, which had devastated Soviet armor in earlier campaigns, were often destroyed by concentrated artillery before they could fire more than a few shots. Volkssturm and Hitler Youth, many too young or too old for war, were shredded in the crossfire, their bodies mingling with those of seasoned Wehrmacht veterans. Survivors stumbled back toward Berlin, their faces hollow with exhaustion and disbelief, knowing that every kilometer gained by the Soviets meant the destruction of yet another German unit. Desertion became more common as morale collapsed, but even those who fled rarely survived long in the chaos of collapsing lines. Civilians often discovered corpses in ditches, their uniforms stripped away, their lives extinguished in anonymous, forgotten deaths. The defenders had fought with ferocity, but the toll left their ranks skeletal, their formations reduced to shadows of what they once had been. For Germany, the Seelow Heights marked not only a military defeat, but a human catastrophe from which no recovery was possible. The destruction extended far beyond the soldiers themselves, engulfing the civilian population caught in the storm. Entire families were wiped out in bombardments, as Soviet artillery blanketed villages suspected of harboring German troops. Wooden cottages splintered into fragments, their inhabitants buried under rubble or incinerated in flames that spread uncontrollably through straw roofs. Survivors fled into the forests, carrying what little they could on their backs, only to find themselves strafed by aircraft or caught between advancing columns. Refugees often moved in endless columns, their carts overturned in muddy roads, littered with corpses of horses shot down by stray fire. Mothers clutched infants against their chests, their cries drowned out by distant detonations and the whine of shells overhead. Old men hobbled behind them, dragging memories of past wars into the final catastrophe of this one. The very land seemed to mourn. The fields once green with spring growth now blackened by fire, the rivers running red with mingled blood and clay. Animals fled in terror, cows and dogs wandering aimlessly through ruins without their masters. Civilians, once bystanders in a war of armies, had now become unwilling participants in its full brutality. The Seelow Heights were not just a battlefield, but a place where the fabric of society itself was torn apart, leaving only ashes in its wake. The Soviet effort to break through exacted such a price that even the Red Army's commanders began to grasp the staggering implications. Reports filtered upward that entire divisions had been effectively erased, with some units reduced to mere hundreds of survivors. Zhukov, who had promised Stalin swift victory, was forced to admit privately that the offensive was consuming men at a pace reminiscent of the darkest days of the Eastern Front. Yet Stalin's voice on the phone was cold, reminding him that Berlin had to be taken at all costs, no matter how many corpses paved the way. The field commanders, under such pressure, drove their exhausted troops into fresh assaults, often with little rest and no reinforcements. Officers led from the front, shouting orders as bullets cut them down, their replacements stepping forward within minutes. It became a war of attrition that stripped away humanity, reducing men into statistics, and statistics into the currency of victory. Still, the Red Army advanced, pushing through minefields, wire and fortified bunkers, leaving behind a trail of unmarked graves. For many soldiers, survival became an accident of chance, being one step to the left of a shell burst, or the last man to fall in a charge before the Germans broke. This mechanical, relentless advance cost dearly, but it also ensured that the German line would eventually shatter under the weight of sheer sacrifice. The physical environment itself bore scars that would last for generations. Fields once planted with wheat were churned into seas of craters, each filled with stagnant water, blood, or shattered helmets. Forests were reduced to splintered skeletons of trees, their trunks blackened and smoking, their branches strewn across tangled barbed wire. Roads disappeared under wreckage, burnt-out tanks, overturned carts, and the twisted metal of trucks abandoned in haste. Rivers were clogged with debris, bridges blown to fragments, their remnants sticking out like broken bones from muddy banks. Even the air seemed poisoned, thick with smoke, cordite, and the nauseating stench of decaying bodies. Farmhouses that had once echoed with children's laughter now stood hollow, their walls pockmarked with bullet holes, their doors swinging in the wind like gravestones of forgotten lives. Churches, once places of sanctuary, were desecrated by shellfire, their bells silenced, their altars buried under rubble. The earth itself seemed to cry out, as if it could not absorb any more blood or destruction. The land had become a graveyard, not just for soldiers, but for the very civilization that once thrived upon it. In the aftermath, the Seelow Heights were more than a battlefield, they were a scar carved into the soul of Europe. Witness accounts from both sides underline the scale of the suffering, painting images that statistics alone could never convey. Soviet soldiers spoke of charging across fields so littered with corpses that their boots slipped on blood-soaked mud. German defenders described the horror of watching entire Soviet companies mowed down, only for fresh waves to appear moments later. A Soviet medic recalled carrying wounded men back under fire, only to watch them die in his arms before reaching safety. A German officer wrote in his diary that he had no tears left, having buried his entire platoon with his bare hands in a shallow ditch. Refugees told of sleeping in forests beside the bodies of strangers, unable to dig graves fast enough as the dead piled higher each day. Horses collapsed beside wagons, their bloated carcasses adding to the stench of death that clung to every breath of wind. Children stared blankly, too shocked to cry, their innocence stolen forever in a matter of hours. Survivors from both armies admitted that the human spirit itself seemed to collapse under the weight of so much killing. No words could fully capture the despair, but every story added another layer to the immense tragedy. The Seelow Heights were not only a military struggle, they were a human catastrophe of biblical proportions. When the guns finally fell silent, the battlefield was left as a monument to destruction, a place where victory and defeat seemed indistinguishable. The Soviet army had finally achieved its breakthrough, but at a cost so immense that even its generals wondered whether it could be called a triumph. German defenders had fought valiantly, but their annihilation left nothing behind but empty uniforms and shattered equipment. Civilians who returned to their villages found nothing left to return to, only ashes and bones marking the place where homes once stood. The casualty lists mounted into the tens of thousands, a grim ledger of humanity paid in blood for a few kilometers of ground. Survivors wandered like phantoms through the wreckage, their eyes haunted by memories that would never fade. For the Soviet Union, the victory paved the road to Berlin, but it was purchased with the sacrifice of countless sons and fathers. For Germany, the loss marked the irreversible collapse of its defenses, sealing the capital's fate in the weeks to come. The earth, scarred and silent, became a grave for an entire generation, its soil nourished with sorrow. The human cost of the Seelow Heights was more than statistics. It was the sum of every broken body, every extinguished dream, and every soul that perished in the inferno of April 1945. Deep beneath the shattered heart of Berlin, in a labyrinth of reinforced concrete and dim corridors, Adolf Hitler withdrew from reality into the oppressive confines of the Führerbunker. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, stale rations, and the constant tremor of distant artillery shells pounding the city above. Outside, the Third Reich was collapsing in flames, yet inside these walls, Hitler clung to fantasies of counteroffensives and miracles. Maps sprawled across the bunker's war room table became canvases of delusion, with Hitler's trembling finger tracing imaginary troop movements that no longer existed. His generals, weary and silent, stood around him like prisoners, knowing the truth but unable to voice it. He believed divisions could be shifted on paper, as though armies materialized by command alone. Reports of destroyed units were dismissed as cowardice or betrayal, not the inevitable consequence of overwhelming Soviet strength. Each day, he drifted further into a world of illusions, where reinforcements from Steiner's phantom armies were always on the way. The bunker became not a command center, but a theater where Hitler staged his final act of denial. Every detail of the collapsing front was bent to fit his distorted vision of destiny. In these desperate April days, the soundscape of the Führerbunker was one of muffled explosions, echoing footsteps, and whispered despair. Staff officers and secretaries worked in hushed tones, their faces pale from exhaustion and dread. Hitler, stooped and frail, would shuffle from his private quarters into the conference room. His once commanding presence diminished to that of a gaunt shadow. His left hand trembled uncontrollably, his gait unsteady, yet his voice still carried bursts of furious rage when news displeased him. Telegrams from the front lines reported catastrophic losses, with armies annihilated and cities falling, but he greeted them with venomous tirades. Generals were accused of treason, soldiers of cowardice, and entire corps condemned for imagined disobedience. His world was shrinking, collapsing inward like the city that encased him. Yet he maintained his belief that a final reversal of fortune would occur, that Germany's destiny as a 1,000-year Reich could not end in ruin. It was not strategy that governed his decisions now, but obsession, paranoia, and the need to impose his will upon a reality slipping beyond his grasp. For those in the bunker, every briefing was a ritual of listening to madness. Perhaps the greatest symbol of Hitler's delusion in these days was his faith in General Felix Steiner. Hitler ordered Steiner's non-existent divisions to launch a counterattack against Zhukov's First Belarusian Front, a phantom offensive he believed would stabilize the crumbling defenses east of Berlin. In truth, Steiner commanded only fragments of exhausted units, incapable of mounting even a token resistance. The generals in the bunker knew this, and when they hesitated to carry out the impossible, Hitler erupted in volcanic fury. He slammed his fists upon the table, veins bulging, his voice shrieking accusations of betrayal. This was not the outburst of a leader issuing commands, but of a man raging against the inevitable. To his staff, the infamous Steiner order became the moment his grip on military reality entirely dissolved. It was not only a tactical fantasy, but a declaration of faith in miracles over material strength. The collapse of the Seelow Heights had sealed Berlin's fate, yet in Hitler's mind, salvation was just a counterattack away. His fury was not directed at the enemy, but at those closest to him, whom he accused of failing to match his imagined resolve. It was the tyranny of delusion, broadcast as command. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere became increasingly suffocating, both physically and psychologically. Supplies dwindled, and mealtimes were reduced to meager rations, often nothing more than canned vegetables or thin soups. Yet Hitler remained rigid in his routines, gathering with a small circle of secretaries, adjutants, and Eva Braun, who had followed him into the bunker. She, cheerful in her forced optimism, attempted to lift the gloom with chatter and light-heartedness. Though the doom outside seeped into every conversation, the younger staff clung to any semblance of normality, even as they heard the city above collapsing in fire. Outside reports of Soviet breakthroughs were replaced by the sound of artillery landing within Berlin itself. Every hour the city drew closer to encirclement, yet Hitler persisted in demanding reports of divisions that no longer existed. His faith in the SS as an invincible bulwark remained unshaken, though these units were reduced to remnants. The bunker was no longer a place of leadership, but a mausoleum of denial, its occupants suspended between the weight of history and the collapse of reality. Every passing day turned the Führerbunker into a prison of doom. Generals such as Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl struggled to maintain the illusion of military order, presenting situation reports that omitted the full scale of disaster. They knew that to confront Hitler with unvarnished truth risked an eruption of rage followed by dismissal, or worse. Those still loyal disguised their despair in rehearsed words, offering hopeful interpretations of hopeless situations. Maps filled with red arrows of advancing Soviet armies were treated like technicalities rather than death sentences. Heinrici's shattered forces, retreating in tatters from the Oder line, were never acknowledged as broken. Instead, Hitler demanded their regrouping and counterattack. Even as radio signals failed and communications collapsed, he believed the German army could still reconstitute itself. It was as if time itself was frozen in the Führerbunker, where past victories were replayed in his mind as proof of an inevitable future triumph. His generals, though aware of the futility, remained trapped, orbiting the gravitational pull of his authority. No man dared break the silence with words of finality. In the bunker, reality was a forbidden subject, and survival meant playing a role in Hitler's theatre of delusion. The psychological toll upon those who served in the bunker was immense, as each day forced them to witness the spectacle of a leader unraveling before their eyes. Hitler's monologues grew longer, filled with rambling speeches about destiny, betrayal, and his vision of a purified Germanic empire. He spoke less of strategy and more of ideology, rehearsing the same themes as though repetition could make them true. He railed against the Allies, accusing them of conspiracy, while also condemning the German people for failing him in their weakness. It was a shift from leader to accuser, from general to prophet of doom. His delusions became not only military, but metaphysical, as he convinced himself that fate itself was testing Germany. Those trapped with him in the bunker alternated between horror, pity, and resignation. Some still clung to the faint hope of escape or negotiation, but Hitler rejected all such notions. He preferred annihilation to compromise, destruction to surrender. To his staff, it became clear that they were not only witnessing the collapse of the Reich, but the psychological disintegration of its architect. The bunker was not merely headquarters, it was a stage for madness. Meanwhile, as Hitler withdrew deeper into fantasy, Berlin above ground descended into hell. Streets became rubble-choked battlefields, where civilians cowered in cellars while Soviet shells reduced entire districts to dust. Refugees streamed westward, while Volkssturm units, often composed of old men and young boys, were thrown into hopeless street fights. Reports of these horrors trickled down into the bunker, though Hitler refused to hear them. He still imagined that German resilience could outlast Soviet pressure, that the Western Allies might yet intervene against Stalin, or that a rift among the enemy would save him. These illusions kept him speaking of counteroffensives and turning points long after the last possibility of victory had passed. His detachment was so complete that when told of entire cities falling, he barely flinched, treating them as pawns in a game already lost. The generals knew the war was over, but Hitler's words held them hostage in a narrative of salvation. It was not only the walls of concrete that trapped them underground, but the suffocating refusal to confront truth. As the city crumbled above, the bunker remained frozen in delusion below. By mid-April 1945, as the Soviets pressed closer to Berlin, Hitler's bunker existence had become a grotesque mirror of the Reich itself, a hollowed shell, surviving on illusions, sustained by denial. His health deteriorated rapidly, his body failing even as his will raged on. He sat hunched over, whispering of vengeance, his pale face illuminated by the dim glow of bunker lamps. The world above was ending, yet below the dictator clung to myths of destiny. He still issued orders for armies that no longer existed, still condemned generals already in retreat, still spoke of salvation through sacrifice. His inner circle watched in silence, knowing they were living inside the final chapter of the Third Reich. The Seelow Heights had fallen, Berlin was under siege, and yet Hitler insisted that fate had one last turn left in store. The Führerbunker was now both his fortress and his tomb, where power once absolute dissolved into madness. In those darkened rooms, the course of history narrowed to the delusions of a man who could no longer see the world as it was. What remained was not leadership, but a tragic performance at the edge of ruin. As the Soviet Juggernaut smashed through the last organized German defenses at the Seelow Heights, Berlin itself became the final fortress, the last redoubt of a crumbling Reich. The city, once the proud heart of Hitler's empire, was now scarred by months of bombing, its avenues filled with rubble and its skyline dominated by the jagged skeletons of ruined buildings. Yet even in this devastation, orders rang out to transform the capital into a fortress, a Festung Berlin, where every street, every square, and every canal was to become a battlefield. Engineers and civilians alike labored feverishly, dragging stones and steel into makeshift barricades, while tramcars were overturned to block intersections. Tank traps were dug along the grand boulevards, and barbed wire snaked across parks and gardens, turning familiar landscapes into killing grounds. The once bustling Tiergarten was seeded with trenches, pillboxes, and firing pits, its greenery consumed by the machinery of defense. Bridges across the Spree were mined, ready to be blown at the first sign of Soviet tanks entering the city. The government's desperate proclamations painted this preparation as heroic resistance, but most Berliners knew it was the construction of their tomb. Hitler demanded that the city hold out at all costs, an order that would condemn tens of thousands to certain death. For Berlin, the storm was coming, and its citizens could only brace for impact. The defenders tasked with manning this final ring of steel were a pitiful shadow of the armies that had once marched triumphantly across Europe. Hardened Wehrmacht veterans, their ranks reduced by years of attrition, stood shoulder to shoulder with raw conscripts and men pulled from hospitals, barely fit for combat. The Waffen-SS, still clinging to its reputation for ruthless fanaticism, took up key positions at strategic choke points, determined to bleed the Soviets for every street. But alongside them stood the Volkssturm, Hitler's people's militia, composed of old men and teenage boys, many scarcely able to carry their rifles. Boys as young as 12 were issued Panzerfausts and told they would destroy Soviet tanks, while men in their 60s were handed armbands and shovels to dig defenses. Some units had no uniforms at all, wearing armbands to mark their allegiance, their weapons a patchwork of obsolete rifles, captured gear, and anything scavenged from abandoned depots. Training was often a single afternoon, instruction given in courtyards before the men were rushed to defensive positions. The contrast between grim-faced veterans and wide-eyed schoolboys was haunting, a symbol of how utterly depleted Germany's manpower had become. Yet propaganda continued to insist that these ragged ranks would repeat the miracle of Frederick the Great, or the defense of 1813. In truth, the city's garrison was not an army of salvation, but an army of desperation. The Hitler Youth, once an organization of parades and songs, had now become shock troops for the dying Reich, fueled by years of indoctrination. Many of these boys entered the barricades with a blind faith that sacrifice for the Führer would secure Germany's rebirth. Some were eager, clutching Panzerfausts with trembling hands, their eyes alight with a mix of fear and zealotry. Others were terrified children pressed into service, their uniforms still oversized, their faces smeared with dirt and soot. They were ordered into the ruins, tasked with ambushing tanks from basements and attics, their lives treated as expendable against the might of the Red Army. Reports spoke of boys singing patriotic songs as they were marched to the front lines, an eerie echo of the mass rallies that had once defined Nazi pageantry. Behind the defiance, however, was tragedy. These children were thrown into a battle they could never win, against an enemy whose numbers and firepower dwarfed anything Germany could muster. Parents wept silently as their sons disappeared into the shattered streets, unable to stop the machinery of a regime that demanded sacrifice to the very end. The Hitler Youth, once symbols of the Nazi future, had become martyrs of its demise. Their presence in Berlin's defenses was both a propaganda gesture and a grim reality of collapse. Within the Führerbunker, Hitler convinced himself that this patchwork defense could hold the Soviets at bay. He pored over maps, drawing imaginary counteroffensives that relied on phantom divisions long since destroyed. Orders were issued for General Wenck's 12th Army to swing north and relieve the capital, as if fresh forces could still be conjured from thin air. Similarly, the battered 9th Army, encircled east of the Oder, was commanded to break through and save Berlin, despite being barely able to hold its ground. These illusions filtered down into the city, giving false hope to some and fueling despair in others who knew the truth. Goebbels, ever the propagandist, spread tales of miracle weapons and secret alliances, insisting that the Western Allies would soon quarrel with the Soviets and rescue Berlin. Posters promised salvation if the people held out, portraying the city's defense as part of a world historical struggle. But among the military professionals, the charade was impossible to maintain. Ammunition was scarce, fuel was running dry, and even bread was rationed in crumbs. For those preparing to defend Berlin, the orders from above were not strategy, they were death sentences. The physical defences of Berlin were formidable on paper, but fragile in practice. Anti-aircraft guns, once used to repel Allied bombers, were lowered to street level, their barrels pointed at intersections where tanks were expected to appear. Tram lines and rubble blocked avenues, creating choke points that defenders hoped would funnel Soviet vehicles into killing zones. Machine gun nests were built into apartment buildings, and sniper positions were marked out on rooftops overlooking key approaches. Bridges were reinforced with explosives, and every canal crossing was turned into a miniature fortress. But the materials to sustain such defences were lacking. Sandbags were filled with dirt from city parks, while tank obstacles were often poorly emplaced and easily bypassed. Many artillery pieces had no shells, and stockpiles of ammunition were scattered, often inaccessible when the fighting began. Fuel shortages crippled the ability to move reserves, leaving armoured vehicles like the few surviving Panthers and Tigers stranded without mobility. The city's defences relied less on firepower and more on the determination or desperation of the men and boys holding the barricades. In the end, Berlin's walls were not built of stone or steel, but of human resolve pushed to the breaking point. For the civilians trapped inside Berlin, the preparations for defense were both terrifying and surreal. Women and children were ordered into cellars as shelters were prepared for the final siege, their walls trembling from Soviet artillery already thundering in the distance. Rumors swept through the city, tales of atrocities committed by the advancing Red Army, stories both true and exaggerated, feeding a climate of fear. Some families tried to flee westward, pushing carts loaded with what little they could carry, only to be turned back by checkpoints or caught in Soviet air raids. Others resigned themselves to fate, huddling in basements with icons, photographs, or keepsakes, praying the storm would pass over them. The soundscape of Berlin was a mix of hammering construction, distant explosions, and the eerie wail of air raid sirens that seemed endless. In shops, ration lines stretched down the block, with people clutching their last ration cards like lifelines. Bread was blackened, made from substitutes, and water supplies grew unreliable as pipes burst under bombardment. The city, once the jewel of Germany, had become a labyrinth of hunger, fear, and exhaustion. For those who lived there, every hour felt like the countdown to apocalypse. The Wehrmacht officers tasked with organizing the final defense were painfully aware of the hopelessness of their mission. General Helmuth Weidling, appointed commander of Berlin's defense, struggled to impose order on a patchwork of units that answered more to ideology than discipline. He inherited forces that were scattered, understrength, and poorly equipped, yet he attempted to lay out zones of defense with grim professionalism. Command posts were established in basements, telephone lines strung through ruined streets, and orders sent out to hold every sector to the last man. The SS resisted coordination, preferring to maintain their own chains of command and enforce fanatic resistance, sometimes at gunpoint against wavering soldiers. Weidling knew that surrender was inevitable, yet any hint of defeatism could lead to execution under Nazi decrees. Officers who suggested withdrawal were shot, and deserters were hanged from lampposts as warnings to the population. It was a defense sustained not by military logic but by fear, ideology, and the iron will of a regime refusing to admit collapse. Yet amid this madness, there were still professionals who tried to shield civilians where they could, delaying actions and preparing evacuation routes in secret. The defense of Berlin, therefore, was not only a battle against the Soviets, but also against the fatalism imposed by its own leaders. As April 1945 wore on, the city of Berlin stood on the brink a fortress prepared not for victory but for annihilation. The last defences were manned by the remnants of an empire that had consumed itself. Soldiers and civilians alike pressed into a final, desperate stand. Hitler and his entourage still clung to delusions in the bunker, but outside the reality was one of impending catastrophe. The Soviets were assembling their armies on the Oder, massing artillery, tanks and men for the final blow that would end the war in Europe. Within the city, every day felt like the silence before a storm, a stillness that carried the weight of dread. Children played among the rubble because they knew nothing else, while their parents wept at night, knowing the price of what was to come. The final defensive ring was not just physical, it was psychological, a barrier of denial and despair built around a dying regime. Berlin was no longer a capital of empire, but a battlefield waiting to be consumed by fire. When the storm broke, it would not be the clash of equals but the inevitable crushing of the weak by the strong. And yet, even as the Red Army prepared to strike, the city steeled itself for a fight to the death. The Seelow Heights stand today as a scar upon the landscape, their ridges and fields once soaked with the blood of tens of thousands. For 3 days in April 1945, this modest stretch of elevated ground became the crucible upon which the fate of Nazi Germany was sealed. Soviet soldiers, numbering in the millions, hurled themselves at entrenched German defences that had been reinforced with mines, trenches, and hidden artillery. Every slope, every woodline, and every village became a killing ground, where the thunder of artillery mixed with the screams of the wounded. German officers knew the ground well, and Heinrici's foresight in preparing the defences temporarily transformed this shallow ridge into a fortress. But despite the ferocity of their resistance, the sheer weight of Soviet men and machines pressed relentlessly forward. What began as an orderly defense slowly buckled under the crushing force of Zhukov's armies. Seelow, once a name known only to locals, became infamous across Europe as the site of Germany's last stand before Berlin. For the Soviets, the battle was a badge of sacrifice, a grim but necessary price for the final blow against Hitler. And for the world, the Seelow Heights came to symbolize the last flames of a dying Reich. The symbolism of the Seelow Heights rests not only in its geographical position, but in what it represented for both sides. To the Germans, these ridges were the last natural shield before the capital, the final chance to delay the inevitable fall of Berlin. To the Soviets, breaking through meant opening the direct road to the enemy's lair, fulfilling Stalin's demand to be first into the city. The intensity of the fighting reflected these opposing visions, with soldiers on both sides locked in a struggle that surpassed ordinary combat. German soldiers fought with the desperation of men defending their homes, while Soviet troops pressed forward with the conviction that victory lay just beyond the horizon. The losses were staggering. Whole regiments consumed in hours, tanks reduced to smouldering wrecks across the fields. Yet beyond the statistics, the battle revealed the exhaustion and collapse of the German war machine. Despite all preparation, the Wehrmacht could not stop the tide. Seelow became less a line of defense and more a symbol of the Reich's inability to prevent its own destruction. For survivors, the memory of Seelow was etched not in triumph or glory, but in the sheer horror of what unfolded. Civilians recalled entire villages erased by artillery bombardments, their homes reduced to rubble before the Soviet infantry ever set foot inside. German soldiers spoke of endless waves of tanks and men, an unstoppable wall that no defensive line could truly resist. Soviet veterans remembered the fog that concealed German guns, the sudden flashes of fire that cut down their comrades in staggering numbers. Each recalled the soundscape of the battle, the ceaseless roar of Katyusha rockets, the rumble of advancing T-34, the desperate chatter of machine guns echoing through the night. The fields became graveyards, with bodies lying unburied as both armies pressed on. For many, Seelow was not a triumph of tactics but a human catastrophe, a reminder of war's merciless appetite. Long after the battle ended, survivors carried its weight, haunted by memories that no victory parade could erase. In memory, Seelow became the embodiment of sacrifice and futility entwined. Vistula. In the broader narrative of World War II, the Seelow Heights hold a symbolic place far beyond their size. This was not a fortress city like Stalingrad, or a grand strategic theatre like Normandy. Instead, Seelow was a modest elevation overlooking the Oder plain, but it became a decisive passageway to the war's end. The battle encapsulated the entire arc of the Eastern Front: massive Soviet offensives, desperate German defense, colossal casualties, and the inevitability of the Reich's downfall. Historians often describe Seelow as the last gasp of German resistance, a place where discipline and courage could not overcome overwhelming material disparity. It represented the grinding war of attrition that Germany could no longer sustain. Yet it also revealed the cost for the victors, as the Red Army lost tens of thousands in just 3 days of fighting. Thus, Seelow became a dual symbol of German collapse, but also of the sacrifices required to bring about that collapse. It was the final threshold before the storming of Berlin, the ultimate curtain raiser for the last act of the European war. This is it. To the Soviet Union, Seelow became a cornerstone of post-war memory and propaganda. The victory was portrayed as the gateway to Berlin, the climactic achievement of the Red Army's relentless advance from the Volga to the Reichstag. Soviet films, books, and memorials immortalized the heroism of the men who fought and died on the slopes of the heights. Stalin himself celebrated the breakthrough as proof of Soviet superiority, a vindication of his insistence that Berlin be taken by Soviet hands alone. Yet behind the triumphal narrative lay the unspoken truth of the immense casualties. Veterans knew that every meter of ground had been purchased at horrific cost, that the road to Berlin had been paved with their comrades' blood. For them, Seelow was not merely a victory, it was a scar, and for the Soviet people the memory of Seelow carried both pride and grief, a symbol of the sacrifices endured to destroy fascism once and for all. For Germany, the memory of Seelow was much darker. Survivors of the Wehrmacht recalled it not as a battle that could be won, but as a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. In post-war memoirs, German generals described the hopelessness of resisting armies that outnumbered them many times over. Ordinary soldiers remembered the confusion of retreat, the endless columns of wounded, and the haunting knowledge that Berlin was now exposed to civilians. Seelow meant the last collapse of a protective wall. Once the Soviets broke through, the capital itself became the battlefield. Post-war Germany rarely celebrated the defense of the heights. It was instead remembered as a tragic marker of a nation consumed by its own regime's madness. In time, the Seelow Heights became a site of memory, with memorials built not only for Soviet soldiers, but also as a somber reminder of the devastation that consumed both sides. In this way, Seelow became a symbol of German collapse, but also of the futility of prolonging a war already lost. The symbolic weight of the Seelow Heights is also measured by its legacy in military history. Scholars analyze the battle as a classic case of defensive preparation colliding with overwhelming offensive resources. Heinrici's skillful withdrawal tactics and disciplined defensive line delayed the Soviets, but even the best German planning could not stop the tidal wave of manpower and armor. Zhukov's costly frontal assault revealed both the strength and the flaws of Soviet operational doctrine. Massive firepower could break any defense, but at staggering human cost. The Heights became a case study in attrition warfare, a grim lesson for future strategists on the balance between defense and overwhelming force. Yet beyond textbooks, the memory of Seelow lives as an emotional legacy, a place where the abstract numbers of war translated into human suffering. Its fields became synonymous with collapse, its slopes a symbol of the moment when Germany's fate was irreversibly sealed. Today, the Seelow Heights are quiet, their fields reclaimed by nature, their bunkers crumbling beneath grass and moss. Memorials dot the landscape, honoring the fallen on both sides, while museums preserve the memory of the battle for future generations. Visitors walk the ridges and see the ground that once decided the fate of nations, struggling to imagine the carnage that consumed it. Yet for historians, veterans, and descendants alike, Seelow remains more than a battlefield. It is a symbol. It embodies the collapse of the Third Reich, the price of victory for the Soviet Union, and the suffering of civilians caught in between. Its memory endures as a reminder that wars are not only decided by weapons and strategies, but by human endurance and sacrifice. Seelow Heights marked the end of one of history's most destructive wars, opening the road to Berlin and the final downfall of Hitler's regime. In its soil lies the weight of history, a silent testimony to collapse, sacrifice, and the cost of war. As the smoke cleared over the shattered expanse of the Seelow Heights, the battle revealed itself as more than a military confrontation. It was a gateway to the final act of the war in Europe. The Red Army's bloody ascent up the slope symbolized the irreversible momentum that now pressed against Berlin. For the Germans, Seelow was their last fortified bulwark east of the capital, a place where they had hoped to halt the Soviet tide. Instead, it became a graveyard for thousands of defenders, a reminder of the futility of holding back a force that had already encircled them strategically. The sheer weight of men, tanks, and artillery that Zhukov unleashed ensured that no matter how tenacious the defense, collapse was inevitable. The German line cracked, and the remnants withdrew toward the capital in a disorderly stream. For the Soviets, Seelow was both a victory and a grim warning. The cost in lives had been staggering. Soldiers walked past corpses of their comrades strewn across muddy fields, reminders of the price they had paid for each meter. The battle's outcome was certain, yet its toll lingered in every weary face. Seelow's significance lay not only in its geography, but also in its symbolism. As the last threshold before Berlin, the Oder River and the fortified ridges had offered the Germans one final chance to slow the Soviet juggernaut. Yet once broken, the path to Berlin was wide open, with only scattered remnants of units left to mount resistance. The battle thus marked the transition from defense to desperation, as German commanders realized there was no longer any operational depth left to exploit. Civilians in Berlin, hearing whispers of the defeat, sensed that the war was now pressing directly upon their doorsteps. For many, the defeat at Seelow confirmed the inevitability of ruin, while for others it only deepened their fear of Soviet retribution. Propaganda still spoke of miracles, but the reality on the ground told a different story. For every German family, the battle became a harbinger of their capital's fate. And for the Allies observing from the West, it was clear that Berlin's fall was only a matter of days. On the Soviet side, the Battle of Seelow entered legend as a test of endurance, coordination, and sheer willpower. Marshal Zhukov's armies had suffered massive losses, but they had broken through one of the Reich's strongest defensive positions. The thunderous opening barrage, tens of thousands of guns firing simultaneously, became emblematic of the Red Army's overwhelming power. Soldiers spoke of the ground shaking like an earthquake, the sky flashing with unnatural brightness, and entire forests splintering under the weight of fire. Yet for all its ferocity, the bombardment failed to fully neutralize the defenses, and the Soviets had to claw their way forward in brutal close combat. For many veterans, Seelow became the most haunting memory of the war, a place where victory seemed certain, yet remained agonizingly out of reach until the third day. The breakthrough, when it came, was greeted not with jubilation, but with exhausted relief. It was the last time the Red Army would fight such a pitched battle before the final storming of Berlin. For the German defenders, Seelow embodied the futility of sacrifice at the twilight of the Reich. General Gotthard Heinrici, the architect of the defense, had predicted the inevitable collapse even as he orchestrated masterful delaying tactics. His men, many of them young recruits, Volkssturm and battered veterans from the Eastern Front, fought with remarkable tenacity under impossible conditions. Machine gun nests, camouflaged artillery, and concealed anti-tank guns turned the ridges into killing fields. Yet wave after wave of Soviet armor and infantry wore them down, bleeding their formations to fragments. By the battle's end, entire regiments had ceased to exist, and the survivors limped back toward Berlin in disarray. For these soldiers, Seelow was not remembered as a place of glory, but as a grave where countless comrades fell for a cause already lost. It marked the final gasp of German defensive strategy before the complete disintegration of command and morale. Seelow Heights also left a profound impression on the civilians who lived in its shadow. Villages were reduced to rubble, farms trampled into mud, and families displaced by the tidal wave of combat. Those who had remained were caught between the merciless barrages of Soviet artillery and the desperation of retreating German units. Stories from survivors spoke of entire families huddling in cellars, trembling as the ground shook above them. When the Red Army finally passed through, fear of retribution hung heavy in the air. Some were spared, others suffered violence and dispossession, as years of Nazi brutality were repaid with vengeance. The fields of Brandenburg became both a battlefield and a graveyard, the landscape forever scarred by trenches, craters, and shattered forests. For generations to come, these scars remained a silent testament to the ferocity of the clash. In historical memory, Seelow Heights became more than just a military encounter. It became a symbol of the collapse of the Third Reich itself. It represented the moment when the German defensive myth shattered under the weight of overwhelming force. In the West, the battle was often overshadowed by the drama of Berlin's fall, yet for the Soviets it was the crowning achievement of years of grinding struggle. Soviet war memorials enshrined Seelow as a place of sacrifice and victory, where tens of thousands of Red Army soldiers gave their lives for the final conquest. In East Germany, during the Cold War, the battle was mythologized as proof of the Soviet Union's decisive role in liberating Europe from fascism. Visitors came to see the monuments, the preserved trenches, and the museums that kept alive the memory of those days. For Germans, however, it remained a place of mourning, where the tragedy of a nation's downfall played out in blood. The legacy of Seelow also carries broader lessons about the nature of modern warfare. It showed the devastating consequences of total war when civilian areas became battlefields and entire landscapes were consumed by mechanized slaughter. The staggering casualties, over 70,000 Soviet dead and tens of thousands of German losses, underscored the price of the final push toward victory. It was a battle fought not only with steel and fire, but with exhaustion, desperation, and the will to end a war that had already claimed millions. The imbalance of power was stark, yet the defenders inflicted a terrible cost on their attackers, proving that even in its death throes, the Reich could still exact a brutal toll. The lessons of Seelow would be studied by military historians for decades, as an example of both the effectiveness and the limitations of overwhelming firepower. It stood as a reminder that victory in the end is often bought with unimaginable sacrifice. As the Red Army surged past Seelow and advanced into the outskirts of Berlin, the battle's meaning became clear. It had been the last true stand, the final test of whether the Reich could still muster resistance. Its failure meant that the capital was doomed, and within 2 weeks, Hitler's empire would collapse in ruins. Yet Seelow remained etched in memory, not only as a gateway to Berlin, but as a symbol of the war's final chapter, the blood, the despair, and the inevitability of the end. Today, when historians and filmmakers revisit the story of Berlin's fall, they inevitably return to the slopes of Seelow. The hills still rise quietly over the Oder plain, their silence concealing the thunder that once shook them. The fields that once ran red with blood are now green, yet beneath them lie the remains of tens of thousands who fought and fell. Seelow Heights endures as both a monument and a warning, a reminder of the human cost paid at the very gates of Berlin.